connected to iPhone.
I'ma just shoot for my mama. I stood right in front of your honor. When I get home, I'm a farmer. Fool, couple years older like Arthur. Bitch, I'm dead in your father. You let me talk that my drama. Bitch, I'm my mom. We gonna solve her. Oh, they gon' out of the room. Chasing the loop, never caught in the loop. See what the fuck is go big in the booth. In the booth, see them, see them on shoot. Bitch, I'm on the back, it's a boot. She want the fuck of my boo. But I can't come for no shackles on you. Fucking this up.
Don't be left in the dark. Find your left in the dark deals. Check your local listings.
A murder between partners in crime sets off. know what I got cash, I'm going on the sheet one day. First time you see me out, no breeze out my blank back. Dumping the clip on her bitch, they hold her smoking, I X up the switch. Left to the mic and just let me spit. She said they working it, hook up the dick. I'm that shit, not get it. Got loud ass, my switch on my life, man, I kill it, yeah, I kill it on my life. I'm a hustler, I'm a hustler. I was there to be the best, and ain't nobody else can fuck with you. I don't fuck with you, boy, you need to get your numbers up, get your numbers up. I was there to catch your body with the shot and twisting up the marijuana all day. Feed her, counting this money all day. Bet you can't see us, cause the money in the way. Smoking OG blunts to the motherfucking face. Bitch, I'm sipping Ace's face. Bitch, it's solid getting paid. Blowing money in the air, trapping on the Segway. Stepping on the flip phone. Got it dope for the low. In and out the trap house, bitch, I'm getting bankroll. Know that you ain't see me. I'm trapping on the flip phone.
I need quarantine in the same league, we don't call the same thing. I don't need no skill, keep it wrapped, it's on the scale. I got the drink is real, orange soda, Keating grill, orange soda, Keating grill. Got the drink is real, got the drink is real, orange soda, Keating grill, orange soda, Keating grill. Fuck the fizz and flip the judge, fuck the top, they catch us. Fuck good job, I'm the judge. It's the 50 of the semi, tell me what you want. I got that, send it to me, I'ma get it off. Wake up early in the morning just to go and get it. Wake up early in the morning just to go and get it. Tell me what you want. I got that, send it to me, I'ma get it off. Wake up early in the morning just to go and get it. Wake up early in the morning just to go and get it. Bag it up, those skills. Keep the tag next day through the mill. But you don't wanna go to jail. Keep the block in the streets, raise hell. Got 30 egg ice in the field. I take rig, cause I'm about to leave. I'll phone you away in the field. So I just say, I'm the weekend. Tag it up, those skills. Keep the tag next day through the mill. But you don't wanna go to jail. Keep the block in the streets, raise hell. Got 30 egg ice in the field. I take rig, cause I'm about to leave. I'll phone you away in the field. So I just say, I'm the weekend. Real fast to the next day. Cause I got clientele. I got clientele. I got the drink is real. Orange package back in sale. I don't need no skill. Keep your wrapped, it's on the scale. I got the drink is real. Orange soda, Keating grill. Orange soda, Keating grill. Got the drink is real. Got the drink is real. Orange soda, Keating grill. Orange soda, Keating grill. Fuck the fizz and flip the judge. Fuck the cops, they catch us slugs. Fuck good job, I'm the judge. It's the 50 of the semi, tell me what you want. I got that, send it to me, I'ma get it off. Wake up early in the morning just to go go and kill it.
I got clientele, I got clientele. Wake up early in the morning just to go and kill it. Wake up early in the morning just to go and kill it. I got clientele, I got clientele. I got clientele, I got clientele, I got clientele.
Man, I don't know what the fuck these hoes on. Fuck all these bitches, man. I'm finna motherfucking beat my motherfucking dick all day. These hoes know me like Dino Spumoni. Stick up your homies, office reggaetoni. Sega cartridges, how they blow me. This my occupation. Robbing bitches for that ticket, sorta like my proclamation. If they licking at your retention, say no conversation. 626, when a nigga spit, I'm that abomination. Hit licks when I'm with my clique, yeah, that's my congregation. Hold the record for most yards ran, I'm Walter Payton. This that shit that make you wanna get about your mama's basement. Kill a couple niggas, burn a couple bridges, nigga, just to feed your baby. Ain't nothing pussy, get your cookies took, little bitch, don't be mistaken. I'm on the phone with straight cash, this my little bitch, we caking. Said I'm on the phone with straight cash, this my little bitch, we dating. My Baltimore nigga said he got a nigga on them fucking Ravens. Said ain't no half, said a nigga can have, don't need no bucks for payment. Might beat your ass, do a nigga bad, leave you on that fucking payment. Kidnap your favorite, take it to the Cayman, skip dicks and make a rated. Fuck on no bitches today. Just wanna be my dick and have visions of getting paid. Said I don't wanna fuck on no bitches today. Hey. Said I don't wanna fuck on no bitches today. Just wanna be my dick and have visions of getting paid. Said I don't wanna fuck on no bitches today. Hey.
I got you on top of it right now.
That's way before Instagram. Hey, I used to serve it to your man. Hey, postman. What is? Walk, please walk, 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 walk,
Watch your back, get that cash, better take cover for another motherfucker. Maybe slowly found the corner. The devil told me what to do, now I can see inside of you. Do not worry, how they will find you on the floor. Never say, can I face all these fucking clues? What the fuck you do? Can I hide? Never realize that you can't feel the lead going through your fucking head. No dark fucking talks, moving with the fuck about. Can you believe what the fuck just happened to me? I ain't never lied. Can you feel the devil's side? Skip your main, another motherfucking homicide. Evil is my mind, never ever justified.
everybody out of gang splash, 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 splash. Gang shit, bitch, gang. Fuck boys out wearing fake. Yeah, I'm bathing in a camouflage. I'm a bathing nigga. You might see me glowing, I'm straight up fucking gay. You might see me sipping purple and smoking something great. I ain't fucking with no phonies, had a weed out of snakes. I ain't fucking with nobody, you a basic bitch, okay? You might see me out here flossing, bitch, I ball like NBA. You might see me out here wearing diamonds, cost me 40K. I been rolling in a Rari while the bitch, she give me cake. I been all up in the kitchen and I'm setting KK. Yeah, shawty wouldn't for me like a fucking easy take. So I smoke a clove, that shit, roll up to my face. I see you doing that shit, I know you want it, just fake. I might ball up in these girls, I'm on fellas all day. I ain't loud pass, shawty missing hella player, yeah. 2016, praying got it straight out the game. They lost it with the butter, cold in the crack. How the jet to Paris, and we done a couple rest. Yeah, get the juggy, then we made it right back. Yeah, my bitch's pussy wants a couple rest. Yeah, shawty know she like the way I full rap. Yeah, diamonds on me looking like a couple rest. Yeah, I be smoking on the roof back. Cold pints in a black jean, sport backpack. You might pull up to the club and nobody notice it. I've been chillin', smoking marijuana by the ocean too. I've been sipping champagne with some perks, caution too. Bitch, I call out all I know I'm gonna do. I'ma keep that lights on, cause these haters don't say. They saw I'm in the crib, say twistin' up the day. All these all sippin' drink, and my bitch, she say I'm great. Baby, it's up on my wrist, grab the top up on my whip. Getting diamond from her bitch, she say she like the way I spit. She say she like the way I wet. She say I'm silly with the wrist. I got 30 bitches and I call them each iPhone. I was rolling switches through the city with my eyes closed. Things are that simple.
Can't leave rap alone. Can't leave rap alone. The game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome. It ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone. The game needs me. Can't leave rap alone. The game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome. It ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me.
Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Roll up the next blunt.
Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me.
Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me. Haters want me clapped and chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Chrome, it ain't easy. Can't leave rap alone, the game needs me.
Yo, what's up, guys?
Of Eastern Europe and the great
people watching here tonight, they want to base their vote on differences between the two of you as president. Is there any difference?
We have a fundamental choice to make. Are we going to step up to the plate as a nation, the way we did after World War II? The way that generation of heroes said, okay, the United States is going to be the leader. And the world benefited tremendously from the courage that they showed in those post-war years.
Yeah, I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be. We can help. And maybe it's just our difference in government, the way we view government. I mean, I want to empower people. I want to help people help themselves, not have government tell people what to do. I just don't think it's the role of the United States to walk into a country and say, we do it this way, so should you.
What the
So I'm not
fuck? That's exactly
sure
what he
where the
did.
Vice President's coming from, but I think what we need to do is convince people who live in the lands they live in to build the nations. Maybe I'm missing something here. I mean, we're going to have kind of a nation-building corps from America? Absolutely not. Our military is meant to fight and win war. That's what it's meant to do. And when it gets overextended, morale drops. But I'm going to be judicious as to how to use the military. It needs to be in our vital interest, the mission needs to be clear, and the exit strategy obvious.
The 2000 presidential election between George Bush and Al Gore confronted the American people with two different visions of the future. Few remember that exactly 100 years before, the American people had been asked to make a similar choice. They were asked to decide whether the United States should be an empire. Republican William McKinley's vision of the American future lay in free trade and overseas empire. By contrast, Democrat William Jennings Bryan was an outspoken anti-imperialist.
I can conceive of a national destiny.
Few noticed a third choice, socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs.
The socialist movement is as wide as the world.
The socialist movement represented the new working class when no one else would. To them, empire meant one thing and one thing only: exploitation. Incumbent President McKinley was running off a soaring economy and a victory over Spain in the War of 1898. McKinley believed that America must expand to survive. Bryan, known as the Great Commoner, was an enemy of industrial tycoons and bankers and was convinced that McKinley's vision would bring disaster. Quoting a letter by Thomas Jefferson, he said,
If there be one principle more deeply rooted than any other in the mind of every American, it is that we should have nothing to do with conquest.
Having now annexed several foreign colonies, the Philippines, Guam, Pago Pago, Wake and Midway Islands, Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and asserted practical control over Cuba, the United States was about to betray its most precious gift to mankind. This is 1900. While most Americans thought the United States had fulfilled its manifest destiny by spreading across North America, it was William Henry Seward Secretary of State to both Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, who articulated a far more grandiose vision of the American empire. Although he failed more often than he succeeded, he set his sights on acquiring Hawaii, Canada, Alaska, the Virgin Islands, Midway Island, and parts of Santo Domingo, Haiti, and Colombia. A lot of his dream would actually come true. But while Seward dreamed, the European empires acted. Britain led the way in the last 30 years of the century, gobbling up 4.75 million square miles of territory, an area significantly larger than the United States. As the Romans did, Britain believed her mission was to bring civilization to mankind. France added 3.5 million square miles. Germany, off to a late start, added 1 million. Only Spain's empire was in decline. By 1878, European empires and their former colonies controlled 67% of the Earth's land surface. And by 1914, an astounding 84%. By the 1890s, Europeans had the Earth's land surface. And by 1978, only Spain's empire was in decline. By 1878, European empires and their former colonies controlled 67% of the Earth's land surface. And by 1914, an astounding 84%. By the 1890s, Europeans had carved up 90% of Africa. The lion's share claimed by Belgium, Britain, France, and Germany. The United States was anxious to make up for lost time, and although empire was a hostile concept to Americans, most of whom had come from immigrant stock, it was now an era dominated by the robber barons. In particular, an aristocracy known as the 400, with their huge estates, private armies, legions of employees. Men like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and William Randolph Hearst held enormous power. The capitalist class, haunted by visions of the revolutionary workers who formed the Paris Commune of 1871, conjured up similar visions of radicals upsetting the system in the United States.
What's the use of talking? Talking's done nothing. The pamphlets are no good either. What we want is action. Yeah! We'll tear up the streets of Paris. If they've got bayonets, we've got knives.
These radicals, or communards, were also called communists almost 50 years before the Russian Revolution of 1917. Jay Gould's 15,000-mile railroad empire epitomized the worst of the robber barons. He was perhaps the most hated man in America, having once boasted that he could hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. When the financial panic of Black Friday hit Wall Street, it triggered the nation's worst depression to date. Mills, factories, furnaces, and mines shut down everywhere in large numbers. 4 million workers lost their jobs. Unemployment reached 20%. The American Railway Union, headed by Eugene Debs, responded to layoffs and pay cuts by George Pullman's Palace Car Company and shut down the nation's railroads. Federal troops were sent in on the side of the railroad magnates. Dozens of workers were killed, and Debs spent 6 months in jail. The socialists, trade unionists, and reformers at home protested that capitalism's cyclical depressions resulted from the underconsumption of the working class. In his pioneering photography, Jacob Riis shocked the nation by first documenting the misery of New York City's poor. Working class leaders were arguing for redistributing wealth at home so that working people could afford to buy the products of America's farms and factories. But the 400, the oligarchs, responded that this was a form of socialism. They said there could be a bigger pie for all, and argued that the U.S. had to compete with foreign empires and dominate the trade of the world so that foreigners would absorb America's growing surplus. The profit for them was clearly abroad in trade. The chief prize was China. To tap this vast market, the U.S. would need a modern steam-powered navy and bases around the world to compete with the British Empire with its major concession at the port of Hong Kong. Russia, Japan, France, and Germany were all clawing to get in. Businessmen began pressing for a canal across Central America, which would help open the door to Asia. In this climate of global competition, in 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii. Almost 100 years later, a U.S. congressional resolution apologized to Native Hawaiians for the deprivation of their right to self-determination. Cuba, less than 100 miles from the shores of Florida, had revolted against the corruption of Spanish rule, and the Spanish reacted by incarcerating much of the population in concentration camps where 95,000 died of disease. As the fighting increased, powerful bankers and businessmen like Morgan and the Rockefellers, who had millions invested on the island, demanded action from the president to safeguard their interests. President McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana Harbor as a signal to the Spanish that the U.S. was keeping an eye out on American interests. On a night in February 1898, with the tropical heat more than 100 degrees, the Maine was suddenly blown up, killing 254 seamen, supposedly sabotaged by the Spanish. The U.S. Yellow Press, embodied in mogul William Randolph Hearst, led a crazed tabloid reaction and created a vigilante climate for war.
We have no secrets from our readers, Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Thatcher is one of our most devoted readers. He knows what's wrong with every copy of the Enquirer since I took over. Read the cable.
Girls delightful in Cuba, stop. Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
The journals cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Millions read it, convinced that Spain, this decaying Catholic power, was capable of any evil trick to preserve her empire. When McKinley declared war, Hearst took credit. How do you like the journal's war? Often remembered by Teddy Roosevelt's symbolically colorful charge up San Juan Hill, the Spanish-American War was over in 3 months. Secretary of State John Hay calling it a splendid little war. Out of almost 5,500 U.S. dead, fewer than 400 died in battle, the rest succumbing to disease. 16-year-old Smedley Darlington Butler lied about his age and signed up with the Marines. He would become one of America's most famous military heroes, winning 2 Medals of Honor in a career that would shadow America's destiny to come. With victory, American businessmen swept in, grabbing assets where they could, essentially making Cuba into a protectorate. United Fruit Company locked up 2 million acres of land for sugar production. By 1901, Bethlehem Steel and other U.S. businesses owned over 80% of Cuban minerals. More than 70 years later, in 1976, an underreported official investigation by the Navy found that the most probable cause of the sinking of the Maine was a boiler which exploded in the tropical heat, causing the ship's ammunition store to explode. As with Vietnam and the 2 Iraq wars, the U.S., basing its reaction on false intelligence, went to war because it wanted to. In the glow of victory, however, the U.S. found herself with a much bigger problem. She'd acquired from the Spanish a gigantic but ramshackle landmass in the Far East, the Philippine Islands, which were viewed as an ideal refueling stop for China-bound ships. As in the invasion of Baghdad in 2003, the fighting there began successfully. Commodore George Dewey had destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay in May 1898. One anti-imperialist noted, Dewey took Manila with the loss of one man and all our institutions. The Anti-Imperialist League was founded in Boston in 1898, seeking to block U.S. annexation of the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Its ranks included Mark Twain, who famously asked,
"Shall we go on conferring our civilization upon the peoples that sit in darkness? Or shall we give these poor things a rest?"
President McKinley did not share that mindset, opting finally for annexation.
There was nothing left for us to do but to take the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died.
McKinley was ignoring reality. Under the fiery leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, the Filipinos had established their own republic in 1899 after being freed from Spain, and like the Cuban rebels, expected the United States to recognize it. They had overestimated their ally, and now they fought back. After one protest, Americans lay dead in the streets of Manila. America's yellow press cried out for vengeance against the barbarians. Torture, including waterboarding, became routine. The insurgents, or our little brown brothers as they were nicknamed, were pumped full of salt water until they swelled up like toads to make them talk. One soldier wrote home,
"We all wanted to kill niggers. This shooting human beings beats rabbit hunting all to pieces."
It was a war of atrocities. When rebels ambushed American troops on the island of Samar, Colonel Jacob Smith ordered his men to kill everyone over the age of 10 and turn the island into a howling wilderness. More than 4,000 U.S. troops would not return from this guerrilla war, which lasted 3.5 years. 20,000 Filipino guerrillas were killed, and as many as 200,000 civilians died, many from the cholera. But because of distorted press reports, mainland Americans comforted themselves with the thought that they had spread civilization to a backward people. American society grew more callous from this war as this new doctrine of Anglo-Saxon superiority not only justified a nascent empire, but changed social relations at home as Southern racists, resorting to similar arguments, initiated a campaign against the true meaning of the outcome of the American Civil War and passed new Jim Crow laws enforcing white supremacy and segregation. In China, a similar yearning for independence led to the homegrown Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Nationalist-minded Chinese rose up with fury to murder missionaries and throw out all foreign invaders. McKinley sent 5,000 American troops to help the Europeans and the Japanese defeat the rebels. Lieutenant Smedley Butler was in the invading force leading his Marines into Beijing, where he saw firsthand the way the victorious Europeans treated the Chinese. He was disgusted. Thus, as in 2008, the 1900 American election took place with U.S. troops tied down in numerous countries. In this case, China, Cuba, and the Philippines. And yet, McKinley, basking in the glow of victory over Spain, beat Bryan by a wider margin than he had in 1896. Socialist Eugene Debs barely registered with under 1%. Americans had clearly endorsed McKinley's vision of trade and empire.
My fellow citizens, recent events and exposed upon the...
At the height of his popularity, McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901. The assassin had complained about American atrocities in the Philippines. The new president, Theodore Roosevelt, an even more unabashed imperialist, continued his policies.
Canal in Panama City! I'll stick it with my own hands if I have to.
And Roosevelt, orchestrating a revolution in Panama, a province of Colombia, signed a treaty with the newly created Panamanian government to lease the Canal Zone, receiving the same rights of intervention the U.S. had forced upon Cuba. The canal was built with great difficulty and finally opened in 1914. In the years to follow, U.S. Marines were repeatedly sent in to protect U.S. business interests in what were now called banana republics, considered backward and in need of strong rule by sometimes brutal dictators able to enforce U.S. business interests on the workers and a resistant peasantry.
It is my policy to protect American citizens and American interests whenever, wherever they are threatened.
Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Panama, Guatemala, Mexico. U.S. occupations often lasted for years, sometimes for decades. No one had more first-hand experience intervening in other countries than Smedley Butler, now a major general in the Marine Corps. Adored by his men, they called him Old Gimlet Eye after a wound sustained in Honduras. And at the end of his long and highly decorated service, he reflected upon his years in uniform.
I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of this country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commission ranks from second lieutenant to major general. And during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Like all the members of the military profession, I never had a thought of my own until I left the service. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefits of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar earnest in 1916. In China, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. Looking back on it, I feel I could have given Al Capone a few hints. Best he could do is operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents.
His overall outspokenness over the years would cost Butler dearly when he was passed over as Commandant of the Marine Corps, which he now left in 1931 under a cloud of contention. War is a racket, is what Butler was saying, and World War I was among the most dismal episodes in human history. One of the lesser-known facts of this story is that on the eve of World War I, the banks of the British Empire were in crisis. Britain's economic model of cannibalizing the economies of increasing parts of the globe in order to survive and not investing in its own homegrown manufacturing was failing. Cycles of depression came and went. In contrast, the newly unified German Empire was leading the nations of continental Europe in a new system away from free trade to protectionist measures that encouraged the growth of a domestic industrial base, not as dependent on colonization. Germany was competing in the production of steel, electrical power, chemical energy, agriculture, iron, coal, and textiles. Its banks and railroads were growing, and in the battle for oil, the newest strategic fuel that was necessary to power modern navies, Germany's merchant fleet was rapidly gaining on Britons. England, now heavily dependent on oil imports from the U.S. and Russia, was desperate to find potential new reserves in the Middle East, which were part of the tottering Ottoman Empire. And when the Germans began building a railroad to import this oil from Baghdad to Berlin through their alliances with this Ottoman Empire, Britain was deeply opposed. The interests of their nearby Egyptian and Indian empires were threatened. Enormous unrest in the Balkans, particularly in Serbia, helped block the Berlin-Baghdad railroad from completion. In fact, it was a minor affair in Serbia that finally set off the chain of events of World War I, when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife were assassinated on the streets of Sarajevo in the baking summer of 1914. The situation deteriorated quickly, and a series of complex alliances between competing economic empires led to the greatest war yet in human history. The war was a slaughter from beginning to end on a level incomprehensible to the public. In the first Battle of the Marne in 1915, the British, the French, and the Germans suffered 500,000 casualties each. The war lasted beyond all expectations. In one brutal single day at the Somme, Britain lost 60,000 dead. France and Germany suffered almost 1 million casualties during the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Repeatedly ordered to charge into the teeth of German machine guns and artillery, France ultimately lost half of its young men between the ages of 15 and 30. Germany first used poison gas successfully at the Battle of Ypres in April 1915, blanketing French troops along 4 miles of trenches. The Washington Post reported that French soldiers were driven insane or died from agonizing suffocation. Their bodies turned black, green, or yellow. The British retaliated with gas at Loos in September, only to see the wind shift and the gas blown back into the British trenches, resulting in more British casualties than Germany. In 1917, Germany unleashed even more potent mustard gas weapons against the British again at Ypres. The novelist Henry James wrote,
"The plunge of civilization into this abyss of blood and darkness is a thing that so gives away this whole long age, during which we have supposed the world to be gradually bettering."
Woodrow Wilson was the embodiment of the Henry James pre-war ideal of hope and civilization. First elected president in 1912, he echoed most Americans' sympathy for the Allies. Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and Russia against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. But he didn't join the war, explaining,
"We have to be neutral, since otherwise our mixed populations would wage war on each other."
He won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but he would soon reverse himself. Wilson was an interesting man. He'd been president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. Descended from Presbyterian ministers on both sides of his family, he exhibited a strong moralistic streak and sometimes a self-righteous inflexibility. He shared a missionary's sense of America's global role and believed in the export of democracy, even to countries unwilling to receive it. He shared as well his Southern forebears' sense of white racial superiority, taking steps to resegregate the federal government. When a delegation of African Americans petitioned him, he replied,
"Segregation is not a humiliation, but a benefit."
The old anti-imperialist William Jennings Bryan, now serving as Wilson's Secretary of State, tried to maintain America's sense of neutrality in the war, but Wilson rejected his efforts to bar U.S. citizens from traveling on ships of countries at war. Britain, which for nearly a century now controlled the Atlantic with its superior naval power, had launched a blockade of northern Europe. Germany retaliated with a highly effective U-boat campaign that seemed to be able to tilt the balance of power on the high seas. In May 1915, a German U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania, leaving 1,200 dead, including 120 Americans. It was a shock. There were calls for America to go to war. But despite initial disclaimers, it was found that the ship was indeed in violation of neutrality laws and carrying a large cargo of arms to Britain. Bryan demanded that Wilson condemn the British blockade of Germany as well as the German attack, seen both as infringements of neutral rights. When Wilson refused, Bryan resigned in protest. Wilson was increasingly coming to believe that if the U.S. did not join the war, it would be denied a role in shaping the post-war world. And in January 1917, he dramatically delivered the first formal presidential address to the Senate since the days of George Washington. He called for peace without victory, based on core American principles of self-determination, freedom of the seas, and an open world with no entangling alliances. The centerpiece of such a world would be a League of Nations that would enforce the peace. Wilson's idealism has always been suspect because it seemed to be consistently undermined by his politics. American neutrality in this war was in effect more a principle than a practice. J.P. Morgan, along with Rockefeller of Standard Oil, had been one of the two titans of American finance since the Civil War. He died in 1913, but his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., effectively served as America's banker to the British Empire between 1915 and 17, when the U.S. entered the war. Initially, the United States would not allow American bankers to float loans to the belligerents, knowing that this would undermine America's stated neutrality. But in September 1915, in his first term, Wilson reversed himself. And in that month, Morgan floated a $500 million loan to Britain and France. By 1917, the British War Office had borrowed close to $2.5 billion from the House of Morgan and other U.S. banks on Wall Street. Only $27 million had been loaned to Germany. By 1919, after the war, Britain found itself owing the U.S. a staggering sum of $4.7 billion, $61 billion today. Morgan also became the sole purchasing agent for the British Empire in the U.S., placing some $20 billion in purchase orders and taking a 2% commission on the price of all goods, favoring friends like DuPont Chemical, Remington, and Winchester Arms. Socialist Eugene Debs had consistently urged workers to oppose the war, observing,
"Let the capitalists do their own fighting and furnish their own corpses, and there will never be another war on the face of the earth."
Whether for financial or idealistic reasons, in April 1917, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, saying, "The world must be made safe for democracy." 6 senators voted against it, including Robert La Follette of Wisconsin and 50 representatives in the House, including Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman ever elected to Congress. Opponents attacked Wilson as a tool of Wall Street. "We are putting a dollar sign on the American flag," charged the respected Senator George Norris of Nebraska. Opposition ran deep, but Wilson got his wish. Yet, despite government appeals for 1 million volunteers, reports of the horrors of trench warfare dampened enthusiasm, and only 73,000 men signed up in the first 6 weeks, forcing Congress to institute a draft. As 1918 dawned, it looked as if the Central Powers might indeed win the war and defeat the Allies, which threatened to leave the U.S. bankers in a huge financial hole. America rallied with patriotic Liberty Bond drives, and many of the nation's leading progressives, John Dewey, Walter Lippmann, took Wilson's side. It was the Midwestern Republicans like La Follette and Norris who understood that the war was a death knell for meaningful reform at home. And Congress demonstrated this in passing some of the most repressive legislation in the country's history, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which curbed speech and created a climate of intolerance towards dissent. University professors who opposed the war were either fired or cowed into silence. Hundreds were jailed for speaking out, including industrial workers of the world leader Big Bill Haywood. Eugene Debs protested repeatedly and was finally arrested in June 1918, saying,
"Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder, and that is war in a nutshell. The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles."
Before being sentenced, he eloquently addressed the courtroom.
Your Honor, years ago, I recognized my kinship within all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While near there is a soul in prison, I am not free.
The judge sentenced Debs to 10 years in prison. He served 3 from 1919 to 21. With Wilson's permission, the Department of Justice destroyed the IWW, the Wobblies, while some Americans marched off to war to the strains of the hit song, Over There.
Over there, send the word,
The Wobblies responded with a parody of Onward Christian Soldiers titled Christians at War, which ended with, "History will say of you, that pack of goddamn fools." 165 of their leaders were charged with conspiring to hinder the draft and encourage desertion. Big Bill Haywood fled to revolutionary Russia. Others followed. German Americans were singled out with particular animosity. Schools, many of which now demanded loyalty oaths from teachers, banned German from their curricula, and orchestras dropped German composers from their repertoires. Just as French fries would later be renamed freedom fries by congressional xenophobes furious at French opposition to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, during World War I, hamburgers were renamed Liberty sandwiches, and sauerkraut was called Liberty cabbage. German measles, Liberty measles, and German shepherds became police dogs. The war years were to bring unprecedented collusion between large corporations and the government in an attempt to stabilize the economy, control unfettered competition, and guarantee profits to munition makers, who were sometimes characterized as merchants of death. It was more than a year after declaring war that U.S. troops finally arrived in Europe in May 1918, 6 months before the war's end, when they helped beleaguered French forces turn the tide along the Marne River. With its manpower and its industrial might, the U.S. presence had an enormous psychological effect on the war. And demoralized the Germans, who finally surrendered. The long, dreary war ended on November 11th, 1918. The losses were staggering. Of the 2 million American soldiers who reached France, over 116,000 died, and 204,000 were wounded. The European losses were truly beyond reason, up to an estimated 8 million soldiers and 6 to 10 million civilians dead, the latter often due to disease and starvation. But as happened in World War II, no people suffered more in this war than the Russians, with 1.7 million dead and almost 5 million wounded. Those who survived were living in a new world order. Britain, France had been badly weakened. The German Empire had collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, more than 50 years old, was over, resulting in the chaotic restructuring of Eastern Europe. and the great polyglot Ottoman Empire of Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, which had lasted for 600 years, now crumbled. In Russia, a mysterious group of revolutionaries known as the Bolsheviks, promising land, bread, and peace, took power in October 1917 in the ruined realm of Tsar Nicholas II, who had lost the army in the slaughterhouse of World War I, and with it the trust of both soldiers and workers who were fed up by the brutality of this war. The Bolsheviks were deeply inspired by a German Jewish intellectual, Karl Marx, calling for the social and economic equality of man. And they immediately set out to reorganize Russian society at its roots, nationalizing banks, distributing land and estates to the peasants, putting workers in control of factories, and confiscating church property. And in March 1918, 8 months before the end of World War I, and almost 2 months before the U.S. troops saw action in France, Vladimir Lenin signed a peace treaty with Germany, pulling Russian troops from the war. Woodrow Wilson and the Allies were furious. The Bolsheviks were vowing to destroy the old secretive ways of capitalism and empire building, throwing them into the dustbin of history. They were promising incredibly world revolution, and there were uprisings in Budapest, Munich, Berlin. The remaining European empires, Belgium, Britain, and France, trembled. Not since the French Revolution some 125 years before had Europe been so profoundly shaken and changed. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, a wave of hope gripped colonized and oppressed peoples on 6 continents. In one brazen act, Lenin's Red Guard ransacked the old Foreign Office and published what was found, a web of secret agreements between the European allies, dividing the post-war map into exclusive zones of influence. Much as the United States would react to the WikiLeaks publications of its diplomatic cables in 2010, the Allies were outraged by this violation of the old diplomatic protocol, which now exposed the hollowness of Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination after the war. Wilson, appalled as he was by Lenin's actions, was already aware and disgusted by what the French and British had secretly agreed to. But nonetheless, he sent American troops into battle on behalf of the French and British empires. The conservative counter-revolution against the Bolsheviks was ferocious. Separate armies were attacking the new Russia from all directions. Native Russians and Cossacks, the Czech Legion, Serbs, Greeks, Poles in the west, the French in Ukraine, and some 70,000 Japanese in the Far East. In reaction, Lenin's co-revolutionary leader Leon Trotsky ruthlessly put together a Red Army of approximately 5 million men. The outspoken but influential ex-Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, said Bolshevism ought to be strangled in its cradle. An estimated 40,000 British troops arrived in Russia. Some deployed to the Caucasus to protect the oil reserves at Baku. Though most of the fighting would be over by 1920, pockets of resistance persisted until 1923, in a foreshadowing of what was to come some 60 years later. Muslim resistance in Central Asia lasted into the 1930s. Wilson initially hesitated to join the invading forces, rejecting the notion of overthrowing the new regime, but ended up sending more than 13,000 American troops and helping arm and finance the anti-Bolshevik forces. Robert La Follette in the Senate deplored this action as a mockery of Wilson's idealism. To deny the counter-revolutionaries their major rallying point, in July 1918, in a devastating shock to the ways of pre-war old Europe, Lenin ordered the execution of the Tsar and his family. The family, who had been exiled into the interior, were shot and brutally finished off with bayonets in the cellar. Lenin's secret police, the Cheka, were successful in mopping up many of the Bolsheviks' remaining enemies. Tales of the Red Terror, often exaggerated, were carried west. And when Wilson allowed U.S. troops to remain in Russia until 1920, it deeply poisoned the beginnings of any U.S.-Soviet relationship. The U.S. would not recognize Soviet Russia until Franklin Roosevelt's presidency in 1933. When he arrived in Europe in December 1918 for the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson was mobbed by adoring crowds, 2 million in Paris. When he entered Rome, the streets were sprinkled with golden sand as per ancient tradition. The Italians proclaimed him the God of Peace. 27 nations met in Paris on January the 12th, 1919. Wilson was a star. The world was going to be remade. It was indeed his most glorious moment in time. But as with Alexander in Babylon, Caesar in Rome, and Napoleon on the frontiers of Europe, a zenith of success had been reached. Wilson considered himself the personal instrument of God, and the peace conference was the crowning moment of his divine mission. In reinterpreting World War I ideologically along the lines of the wars of the French Revolution a century earlier, Wilson was claiming that this was a war to change humanity, a war to end all war. In an address to the United States Senate that year, he was to say,
America's world grow has come by no plan of our conceiving, but by the hand of God. It was of this that we dreamed in our birth. America shall indeed in truth show the way.
In Wilson's view, America's manifest destiny was no longer a case of continental expansion. It was now a divinely ordained mission to humanity. This idea of saving humanity became essential to the American national myth in all subsequent wars. In an attempt to counter Lenin's revolutionary appeal, Wilson had, 1 year earlier, while the war was still raging, announced a set of international democratic principles, including free trade, open seas, and open agreements between nations that would become the basis of a new international peace. He called this the 14 Points. The Germans surrendered on the basis of Wilson's 14 points, believing he would guard them from dismemberment by the Allies. They even changed their form of government, adopting a republic, and opposed the Kaiser, who soon disappeared into exile. The United States was the new dominant force in the world. Although it had been a debtor nation in 1914, owing $3.7 billion, by 1918 it had become a creditor nation and was owed $3.8 billion by its allies. Nonetheless, the old multinational empires that had stood since the Middle Ages had no interest in Wilson's idealism. They wanted revenge and money and colonies. British Prime Minister Lloyd George noted that in the United States, not a shack had been destroyed. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, whose country had lost over 1 million soldiers, commented, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty has only 10. As a result of this attitude, several of Wilson's ill-defined 14 points would be removed from the Treaty of Versailles. Britain, France, and Japan divided the former German colonies in Asia and Africa, and paying lip service to the promised self-determination of the Arabs who had revolted against the Ottoman Empire, Winston Churchill and the Foreign Office divided that empire, creating new client states such as Mesopotamia, which was arbitrarily renamed Iraq.
They've only one suspicion. We'll let them drive the Turks out and then move in ourselves. I've told them that that's false, that we've no ambitions in Arabia. Have we?
I'm not a politician, thank God. Have we any ambition in Arabia, Dryden?
Difficult question, sir. I want to know, sir, if I can tell them in your name that we've no ambitions in Arabia.
Certainly.
The prospect of a future Jewish homeland in Palestine was also established in a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to the Jewish banker Lord Rothschild. A protectorate was established by the League of Nations over Palestine. Approximately 85% of the native population was Palestinian Arab and under 8% Jewish. The old empires sanitized their actions by calling these new colonies mandates, and Wilson went along with it by arguing that the Germans had ruthlessly exploited their colonies, whereas the Allies had treated their colonies humanely. An assessment that was greeted with incredulity by the inhabitants of French Indochina. Ho Chi Minh, as a young man, rented a tuxedo and bowler hat and visited Wilson carrying a petition for Vietnamese independence. Like other Third World leaders in attendance, Ho would learn that liberation would only come through armed struggle, not Woodrow Wilson's largesse. Although Lenin was not invited to Paris, Russia's presence cast a pall over the meetings. Lenin called Wilson a smoother over. He said, "Only genuine revolutionaries may be trusted." And as the delegates sat, communists took over Bavaria and Hungary and threatened Berlin and Italy. Lenin's call for a worldwide revolution was heard in the Third World, in lands as far away as China and Latin America. Focused intently on his League of Nations, which he considered essential to preventing future war, Wilson failed to secure the kind of non-punitive treaty he publicly advocated. As Britain and France perversely applied Wilson's concept of self-determination against Germany, leaving millions of citizens stranded outside their new, shrunken border. In its famous war guilt clause, the Treaty of Versailles placed the entire blame for starting the war on Germany, and not the other colonial empires, and required them to pay almost $33 billion to the Allies in war reparations, more than double what Germany expected. Prominent in Wilson's delegation was Thomas Lamont, the House of Morgan's leading partner, upon whom Wilson relied. Lamont would make sure that Germany's payments to Britain and France would in turn allow them to repay the fortune they had borrowed on Wall Street to survive the war. In reality, then, the entire new structure of international finance was built on the shaky foundation of German war reparations, which would shortly contribute to a German economic collapse, out of which Adolf Hitler would emerge. In years to come, the U.S. Congress would investigate the machinations of the so-called merchants of death. These were the industrialists and bankers who made obscene profits from the war. No one was convicted, nothing proven, but there remained a lingering populist feeling of distrust for World War I. Many, including congressional leaders, felt that millions had been sacrificed in a financial boondoggle for bankers and other war profiteers. The bitterness of this feeling was intense. Wilson came home to a country where American labor was rife with discontent and desperate for reform. In the year 1914, by example, as many as 35,000 workers were killed in industrial accidents. Over 4 million workers went on strike in 1919 alone. 365,000 steelworkers, 450,000 miners, 120,000 textile workers. In Seattle, a general strike shut down the entire city. In Boston, even the police force walked out, leading the Wall Street Journal to warn Lenin and Trotsky are on the way. President Wilson, in response, wanted to kill off Lenin's message. Communism was a European madness, not an American one. In the so-called Red Summer of 1919, even race riots exploded out of control in Chicago and several other cities, including Washington, D.C. Federal troops arrived to restore order. President Wilson continued to travel the land, arguing that the U.S. needed to ratify the Versailles Treaty and established the League of Nations to ensure his vision of world peace. Progressive Republicans denounced Wilson's League of Imperialists, bent upon defeating revolutions and defending their own imperial designs. Critics demanded changes, but no modifications were acceptable to Wilson. His health began to suffer, and at a final speech in Pueblo, Colorado in September 1919, he collapsed. He suffered a severe stroke and was incapacitated for the rest of his life. In November 1919, federal agents were unleashed under Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in the first of a series of raids on radical and labor organizations across the country. The operation was run by the 24-year-old director of the Justice Department's Radical Division, J. Edgar Hoover. Estimates vary from 3,000 to 10,000 dissidents were arrested, many incarcerated without charges for months. Hundreds of foreign-born radicals, including Russian-born Emma Goldman, were deported as civil liberties were increasingly abused, identifying dissent with un-Americanism. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty by 7 votes. The League of Nations was born, but was crippled without the participation of the United States. Wilson died in 1924, a broken man. By the early 1920s, the America of Jefferson, Lincoln, and William Jennings Bryan had ceased to exist. It had been replaced by the world of Morgan, Wall Street bankers, and huge corporations. Wilson had hoped to transform the world, but his record is much less positive. While supporting self-determination and opposing formal empire, he intervened repeatedly in other nations' internal affairs, including Russia, Mexico, and throughout Latin America. While encouraging reform, he maintained a deep mistrust of the kind of fundamental and at times revolutionary change that would actually improve people's lives. While endorsing human brotherhood, he believed non-whites were inferior and resegregated the federal government. While extolling democracy and the rule of law, he oversaw egregious abuses of civil liberties. Wilson's failures capped a period in which America's unique mixture of idealism, militarism, avarice, and diplomacy propelled the country towards becoming a new empire. The public in 1900 had rejected William Jennings Bryan and embraced William McKinley's vision of trade and prosperity, and in so doing, legitimized his imperial conquests. The 1900 election had indeed started the United States on a trajectory upon which there was no turning back.
History, a little bit of American history from around the turn of the century, 1900. I'm just working on the shirt right now. I did get some highlights and stuff on the headset and on the controller. Now you can see where I'm just trying to get some of the brighter whites back into that shirt and make it pop out like that.
Crazy, recent scientific discoveries. With all the negativity in the news of late, such as the Charlottesville marches, the prospect of North Korean conflict, and the impending end of Game of Thrones Season 6, it can be easy to forget that mankind is still making great progress on a number of different fronts. For example, did you know that we're now one step closer to interstellar travel? And that we also know where all the animals came from. Yeah, literally, all of the animals. So let's find out what we just found out in our list of crazy recent scientific discoveries. Number 6. Interstellar spaceships. In late July, mankind took its first tentative steps towards becoming an interstellar species, with breakthrough initiatives launching of a prototype spacecraft capable of traveling to another star system. These spacecraft, known as Sprites, are just 3.5 centimeters wide and weigh around 4 grams. Their design has been in development for over a decade, but now a workable model has finally been created. And the plan is to create thousands of these little dudes and shoot them to Alpha Centauri using lasers. If this technology works as we think it should, these bite-sized spaceships will travel at 37,000 miles an hour, taking 20 to 30 years to reach Alpha Centauri, and 4 years to tell Earth what funky business is lurking there. The operation is part of a project called Breakthrough Starshot, a multi-billion-dollar venture backed by venture capitalist Yuri Milner, Professor Stephen Hawking, and future President Mark Zuckerberg. The project's aim is to launch a fleet of Sprites in the year 2035, and a major hurdle towards this goal was overcome with July's successful splurge of 6 of these lightweight nanocraft into low Earth orbit, where they remain at the time of lighting. Further prototype launches are scheduled imminently, and when future missions do come to reach Alpha Centauri, they will look back at this moment as an important step in mankind's exploration of the cosmos. Or they'll see it as that time we threw a bunch of garbage into orbit. Depends how it works out, really. Number 5. The origin of animals. Until around 650 million years ago, our planet was home to nothing but simple bacteria. Then, complex life evolved. And out of that, every animal you know, love, and hate came to be. So who made all the animals? God? Aliens? A many-tentacled alien god? No, it was these guys. Algae. New research published in the journal Nature has revealed that algae, the first form of complex life, came into existence after a series of events created the perfect conditions for them to thrive. Around 700 million years ago, the Earth was a giant snowball covered in vast glaciers. These glaciers ground huge mountains down into dust, releasing vital life-sustaining nutrients such as phosphates in the process. When the ice melted, these nutrients were washed into the ocean, with the newly warmed climate and delicious ocean waters combining to allow the development of algae. The bacteria, which dominated the oceans, were pushed out by these new complex life forms. And from this base, even more complicated organisms were able to develop. So the only reason we have horses, frogs, chihuahuas, and stink beetles today is thanks to giant ice cubes, mountain dust, and sea gunk. Number 4. Goldfish get drunk in winter. The evolution of simple bacterial life into complex organisms is one thing, but even more impressive is the ability of goldfish to get themselves drunk by carb loading. For a long time, scientists have been curious as to how goldfish survive in frigid, ice-covered, oxygen-deficient lakes. However, a group of researchers led by Dr. Michael Barenbrink from Liverpool University have discovered that goldfish living in such conditions have developed an evolutionary solution to this problem. In the absence of oxygen, the carbohydrates consumed by goldfish produce lactic acid. This acid should kill them. But instead, goldfish have evolved a secondary set of proteins which convert lactic acid into alcohol, which they then expel through their gills. This backup measure is activated when oxygen is sparse, giving the goldfish extra time to wait for the ice above them to thaw. In the meantime, these goldfish have a major buzz going on. When measured in the wild, many goldfish had a blood alcohol level equivalent to the Scottish drink drive limit, and in what can only be described as a complete dereliction of his moral duties, Dr. Barenbrink calculated that to produce booze from an oxygen-starved goldfish trapped in a glass of water, you'd need to keep it there for 200 days to make a 4% alcoholic beverage. Meh, I bet it still tastes better than a Bud Light.
Wow.
Number 3. The cure to peanut allergy is peanuts. Please, for the love of God, listen to the rest of this entry before shoving a heap of dry roasted down your allergic kid's throat. The truth behind this headline is that allergy researchers have discovered that a peanut protein, when combined with a probiotic, can help reduce children's sensitivity to peanuts if administered orally over 18 months. The researchers were led by Professor Mimi Tang, which sounds like a character from a mildly racist Asian porno flick. And they found that around 80% of children could tolerate peanuts and show no signs of allergic symptoms 4 years after their 18-month dose. 70% of children showed 0 side effects and could eat as many peanuts as they wanted. But my question is, what happened to the remaining 20 and 30%? Sorry, kids, you died for a worthy cause. So some other jerk kid can enjoy a Snickers while you choke to death on your own expanded neck flesh.
What?
Number 2, a potential cure for the common cold.
Holy shit.
If anyone's planning on taking a sick day soon, I'd get to it right away. At the beginning of August, scientists at Edinburgh Napier University reported the development of a potential treatment for the common cold, a virus which is known scientifically as the rhinovirus. Whoa, did anyone else not know that? Next time I pull a sickie, I'm definitely referring to myself as being laid low with rhinovirus. That sounds badass. The new treatment is based on something called antimicrobial peptides, and it aims to increase the body's natural response to rhinovirus and help it fight off the infection naturally. To do this, the team used synthesized peptides found in pigs and sheep, which successfully challenged the rhinovirus when they were sent to fight its presence in a batch of lung cells. This research also has the potential to help us fight ever more resistant forms of influenza, too. Although, the eventual outcome from this kind of treatment tends to be the development of superviruses.
Yeah.
And since I've only just found out that the common cold is called...
Because you're gonna build up such a fucking immunity, that shit is just gonna mutate and mutate and mutate into something you can't fucking defend against, yo.
Rhinovirus. I don't think I'm ready for a more vicious upgrade. Scorpion Shark Commitment Virus. Number 1. Antarctic volcanoes. What would you expect to find if you searched deep beneath a giant Antarctic ice sheet? Dinosaurs? Aliens? A German bunker? Climate change deniers furiously grasping onto the ice sheet to pretend it isn't collapsing into oblivion? All of these are good answers. But the actual thing actual scientists actually discovered last month under the actual West Antarctic ice sheet was a total of 91 subglacial volcanoes, which together comprise the largest volcanic region on planet Earth. The tallest volcano discovered by the research team based out of Edinburgh University stands at 4,000 meters tall, which is approximately the height of 4,000 one-meter-tall children standing on top of each other. I say approximately. It's hard to make those lazy little jerks stay upright for more than 5 minutes, unless you give them a good whipping.
What
the bad news is that the eruption of these volcanoes could contribute to climate change by melting more sea ice and dumping it into the ocean. The good news is that we don't yet know how active these volcanoes are. So whether a major climate catastrophe happens or not is an exciting mystery whose answer we must wait to find out. Or maybe we won't, if artificial intelligence murders us all before the ice shelf even drops an inch. The advent of a super smart AI bot is one of several other recent discoveries we're going to talk about in our bonus video. More crazy recent discoveries, which you can watch in our Patreon page at patreon.com/Strange Mysteries. For a $2 a month pledge, which you can cancel at any time, you'll get to watch this and all of our bonus content, which goes deeper and darker into every topic than YouTube allows. If you don't want to donate, then that bull.
We know you wanted more. Strange Mysteries on YouTube and our Patreon bonus videos weren't enough to quench your search for truth, to give you that sense of awe and wonder again, to go past what you thought was the end, to give you the answers you seek, but which only lead to more questions. That's why we just upped the stakes. Chemicals of reality. Reality, consciousness, brains. What else is there? Ask yourself that question. Perhaps that's all there really is, but perhaps everything else is found within a place where these ideas, these things, overlap. Some thing, some place that is undefinable. To many people, altering certain chemicals in their brains produces what they would simply call hallucinations. In fact, what we're going to discuss specifically used to be called the businessman's trip, as one could enjoy it. Come down and put your pants back on in the time it takes to eat lunch. It wasn't taken seriously, well, unless of course you started digging. And some people, including us, did. Already though, to many people, this chemical is special amongst others. Very special. To them, it represents something more meaningful and incredible, as if it's the gateway to the next level of consciousness. The ticket to a higher reality barely explored by most humans. It is the entry point to a new reality, visited by only a select few, whose minds have become enlightened through the use of this exotic substance.
When Aegon and his dragons burned Harren the Black and all his sons at Harrenhal, the days when men feared the sight of our longships were over. Aegon would not permit marauders and raiders in his 7 kingdoms. With Harren died our empire, and the old way that forged it. But what is dead may never die. 6 years after Robert Baratheon won his crown, my father, Balon Greyjoy, sought to restore our ancient rights. He declared the Iron Islands independent, and himself its king, and sent the Iron Fleet in a daring raid on Lannisport, where they burned the Lannister ships at anchor, making us unchallenged in the Sunset Sea. This was the seed of our undoing. My eldest brother Roderick led a frontal assault on Seaguard, a town built to protect the mainland from us. After ferocious fighting beneath the city walls, he was slain by Lord Jason Mallister and his men defeated. By this time, Stannis Baratheon had brought Robert's fleet around Westeros, and somehow managed to trap the Iron Fleet at Bear Isle, smashing it. Robert's victory was now all but assured, yet we made him bleed for each island. Stannis Baratheon captured Great Wick, the largest of the Iron Islands, and Ser Barristan Selmy himself subdued Old Wick. Robert and Lord Eddard Stark led the main assault against the island of Pike. They razed the town of Lordsport to the ground before Robert turned his full fury on our family's stronghold. When they breached the walls, the first through was Thoros of Myr with his ridiculous flaming sword, followed by every minor lord of Westeros hungry for glory. My other brother Maron was killed when the siege engines brought down a tower on his head. I was now my father's only living son, and heir to the Iron Islands. When my father saw his cause was lost, he wisely conceded defeat to Robert, who otherwise would have pulled down our castle stone by stone with us in it. As my father said to me then, no man has ever died from bending his knee. He who kneels may rise again, blade in hand. He who will not kneel stays dead, stiff legs and all. As it stands, Robert allowed my father to keep his lands and title as Lord of the Iron Islands, King of Salt and Rock, Son of the Sea Wind, Lord Reaper of Pike, for a price. His last son and heir shipped off to Winterfell as an honoured guest. I would eat at the Stark's table and play with the Stark children. And if my father rebelled again, Lord Eddard Stark would take his sword and cut off my head. It would be his duty.
On the shores of the God's Eye, due north of the Isle of Faces, rises a monument to arrogance and cruelty. Harrenhal. For a people who prided themselves on their ships, the Iron Men of old seized any chance to leave them, and carved out a vast kingdom from the peaceful river lords. The empire reached its zenith under King Harren Hora, called the Black by those he terrorized, and by his own men, though they meant it proudly. King Harren enslaved the Riverlands to raise the mightiest fortress Westeros had ever seen. A castle that could garrison 1,000,000 men, with walls so vast that winters would come and go, and besieging armies grow old and grey before the castle fell. 5 towers he ordered, reaching into the heavens like grasping fingers. A monstrosity which he forced our people to build for their own subjugation. But the very day the slaves laid the last stone, Aegon Targaryen and his sisters arrived in the south. When they arrived with their small army, Harren laughed and shut the gates. Harrenhal would have its first test, and an easy one at that. It failed. Harrenhal could have withstood an assault from all the armies in Westeros combined. But Harren learned that the tallest and thickest walls meant little to dragons, for dragons fly. With Harren and his sons dead, Harrenhal quickly surrendered to Aegon. House Tully then raised the River Lords in rebellion against the Iron Islands, and with Aegon we flushed the Iron Men to the sea. We should have torn down the castle stone by stone then, but Harrenhal seemed such a magnificent prize that Aegon gave it to one of his commanders, whose line then withered to extinction, as would every family to hold it thereafter. When many speak of Harrenhal, their voices drop to whispers about Mad Lady Lothson, who was said to send a giant bat to collect children for her crockpots, and to bathe in blood and serve feasts of human flesh. About the ghosts of Black Harren and his sons who still walk the castle at night, all aflame. Of the servants who went to bed in full health and were found in the morning burnt to ash. Mere stories to frighten wayward children and excite young girls, you may say. You would not be entirely wrong. Harrenhal is a prize. A nigh impregnable castle with enough land and enough income to make a man, at a stroke, one of the greatest lords in Westeros. But you would not be entirely right either. Say by a king's grace, Harrenhal became yours. Now you must garrison it. You must repair it and maintain it. Even stretched to the ends of your means, you cannot fill and manage the whole castle. So you retreat your household to 4 of the 5 towers, then 3, then 2, then only the bottom thirds of those. You close the whole of 100 hearths and take your meals in your rooms. Even then you can't shake the feeling of desolation, that Harrenhal and its vastness is devouring you. In later years, as you bury a grandson or a great-grandson, the last of your line, you will know it has.
Where the North has its honor and the South its chivalry, the Iron Islands has its strength.
We call ourselves the Ironborn, and we are warriors feared throughout the 7 kingdoms.
Or so we used to be. Unlike their mainland cousins, the first men of the Iron Islands never bowed to the old gods.
Theirs was the drowned god, who made the Ironborn to reave and sack and write their names in salt, steel, and song, that his enemy, the storm god, could not wash away. We raised our kings from our own ranks, and used beaten foes as thralls to work our mines and farm our land.
Or as sole wives, if a woman was pretty enough. Such was the old way, and while we followed it, we held sway wherever the waves were heard. When Aegon came demanding fealty, King Harren the Black ruled as far east as the Trident.
Other kings like the Starks could kneel, but Harren was Ironborn, and the Ironborn must be beaten. In Harrenhal, he had the mightiest castle in Westeros, and the army to defend it.
But Aegon did not intend a siege. He mounted his dragon and roasted Harren and all his sons in their tower, and the Ordway with them. Because of Harren's defiance, Aegon pushed the Ironborn back to our islands and gave the Riverlands to the Tullys. But he did allow the Ironborn to choose who would lead them.
House Greyjoy had always been one of the greatest houses of the Iron Islands. We trace our descent from the Age of Heroes and the legendary Grey King, who took a mermaid to wife and made war upon the Storm God for 1,000 years.
Blessed by the drowned god, the Grey King fought and slew Naga, the great sea dragon, and took her fire for his own.
This history made our ancestor Vicon Greyjoy the natural choice to lead the Ironborn after Aegon's conquest. For 300 years, House Greyjoy ruled the Ironborn. We styled ourselves Lord of the Iron Islands, King of Sultan Rock, Son of the Sea Wind, Lord Reaper of Pike.
In truth, we were thralls. Our people still chanted, "What is dead may never die." But the old way had died.
Until the Targaryens followed their dragons into the grave, and our Lord's father, Balon Greyjoy, rose against the new king, Robert Baratheon. He seized our ancient crown and sent our Iron Fleet against the Lannisters at Lannisport, burning all their ships before any could weigh anchor.
Though Robert and Eddard Stark would later defeat him, they understood us no better than Aegon. The Greyjoy sigil is the Kraken. What it grasped once, it will never surrender.
What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger.
Though Robert had risked all our lives to win it, the Iron Throne bored him. He cared little for justice, and less for rule. If it weren't women or wineskin, he had no use for it. Without the stalwart Jon Arryn as Hand of the King, the challenge to Robert's crown would have come much earlier than it did. The Iron Islands have never lacked for treachery. They respect only strength, and honor is as foreign to them as the Seven. After 6 years, their ruler, Lord Balon Greyjoy, wagered that King Robert had not won the support of the great houses of Westeros, many of whom still named him usurper. Lord Balon declared the Iron Islands independent and sent his Iron Fleet to Lannisport. Lord Tywin Lannister was careless, and the Ironborn caught and burnt his ships at anchor. Lord Balon and his reavers controlled the Sunset Sea. Robert then ordered me to succeed where his father-in-law, Lord Tywin, had failed. Beneath Robert's fury, I sensed relief. War he could understand. He would smash Lord Balon as he had Rhaegar. I raised Robert's fleet and sailed around Westeros to the Iron Islands. I set a trap for the Iron Fleet off Fair Isle. As sailors and warriors, the Ironborn are unparalleled. But they're not soldiers. They have no discipline, no strategy, no unity. In a battle, each man fights only for his own glory, and their longships are built for lightning strikes and shore raids. When the captains rushed in, I smashed their longships with our larger war galleys. The strength of the Ironborn is in their ships. With the Iron Fleet broken, I had assured Robert's victory. He could now transport troops and siege weapons to invade the Iron Islands. And contrary to Balon's hopes, Robert had plenty of both. I've never seen such allegiance as Robert could inspire in war. Enemies who tried to kill him one day would be drinking with him the next under their own fallen banners. In rebelling against the Iron Throne, Lord Balon did more than Robert ever could to cement his rule. When Robert came to the Iron Islands, he brought with him the full power of Westeros. Sir Barristan Selmy of the King's Guard led the assault on Old Wick, while I subdued Great Wick, the largest of the Iron Islands. But Robert saved the seat of House Greyjoy, Pike, for himself and Lord Eddard. Robert would later boast of the battle's bloodiness and how he could have torn down the island into the waves if Lord Balon hadn't bent the knee. But if I'd have led the assault, Balon's neck would have bent under his sword, because I do not forget, I do not pardon. His time will come, all their times will come.
The Seven are gods of weakness and defeat, pretty chains that the first men kindly put on after the Andals crushed them, except in the Iron Islands. Since the Dawn Age, The Ironborn have followed the drowned god, who plucked fire from the sea and made us to reave and sack and carve our names in blood and song. When the Andals landed on the Iron Islands, they found a god who was father, warrior, and stranger, who took mother, maiden, and crone when he would, and held the smith in thrall. His priests are the drowned men, who are clothed and armed by the sea itself. They consecrate us to the drowned god through our most sacred rite, the drowning, and ask the god to raise us from the sea as he was, harder and stronger. The Ironborn do not fear the bloodiest battles or the roughest waves, for the drowned god taught us long ago that what is dead may never die. When an Ironborn falls, we say the drowned god needed a strong oarsman and took him below to feast in the god's watery halls, attended by mermaids. But even in death, an Ironborn is a warrior. We fight against the storm god, who holds a castle in the clouds, and sends the winds to lure the Ironborn off course or wreck our ships. It's said my legendary ancestor, the Grey King, waged war upon the storm god for 1,000 years. With the drowned god's help, he slew the great sea dragon Naga and used her bones for his haul. After his death, the storm god tried to wash away any memory of this terrible foe, but his songs fill our halls to this day. It was the storm god who first blew the Andals to the Iron Islands, to subdue us and turn us from our faith. True, they conquered and killed our king, but in time they forsook their septs for the shore, and their fat septons for the drowned men. The Andals came to us as conquerors. In the end, they drowned. The Ironborn are of the sea, as our god made us, and given to it as our god taught us. We do not fear the storm god's winds or his waves, but you should, for they bring us to you.
Dark wings, dark words. I was only a boy when the Raven came to call my father, Lord Eddard Stark, to another war. Balon Greyjoy had raised the Iron Islands in revolt and burned the Lannister fleet at anchor. King Robert Baratheon again needed his old friend. My mother Catelyn was not happy to lose her lord husband to Robert again. 6 years before, he had left her to avenge his father and brother against the Mad King. But now he had sons and daughters of his own, and, unspoken, another son who wasn't hers from the last time he went to war. My brother, Jon Snow. But she knew that in marrying my father, she had married the North. We hold our honor and duty as dear as our old gods. When the time came, my father marched south to restore peace and order to the realm. My father always told me the Iron Islands were a strange and dangerous place. Its people, the Ironborn, keep neither the old gods nor the Seven, and despise all honest toil. Their ancestors ravaged the western shores, raping and slaving and putting it to the torch, and their songs still ring through the halls of the Ironborn, while everywhere else they are whispered to wayward children at bedtime. Perhaps Lord Balon thought Westeros had not healed from the war against the Mad King, and was as fragmented and suspicious as the ancient kingdoms his forebears had terrorized. Robert's navy corrected him at Fair Isle when they smashed the Proud Iron Fleet. Robert and my father corrected him at Pike, his own castle, when they pulled down his towers and breached his walls. My father never liked to speak of his battles, but from other men I learned what transpired. Thoros of Myr was first through the breach with his flaming sword. Not far behind him was Jorah Mormont of Bear Island, my father's bannerman who earned the knighthood he would later shame, and lords from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. All day, through every passage in the castle, they fought side by side. My father with our ancestral sword Ice, and King Robert with his warhammer against a horde of axe-wielding Ironborn. In the end, Lord Balon bent the knee. King Robert generously allowed Lord Balon to retain his title and castle. The price of peace was custom. The only son of Balon's to survive his foolish rebellion would be taken as a hostage against future treasons. My father even volunteered to foster the boy himself. I suspect, to make Theon Greyjoy a different man than his father, who would bring honor and duty to the Iron Islands when he returned as heir. So my mother's silent fear came true, and my father returned with another child. Theon ate with us, played with us, and fought with us. Once the great bond between my father and Robert Baratheon united the realm against the Mad King and brought him to justice for his crimes. Now, another monster sits on the Iron Throne, and another debt of blood has owed my family. Theon is my murdered father's ward. I am my murdered father's son. Like my father and Robert, bound in blood, if not by blood, we are brothers.
Qarth has always and only belonged to the Qartheen. We were never part of Valeria's empire, nor have we ever fallen to a Dothraki horde. Our walls and the red waste outside them guard us from such annoyance. Many call the approach to our city the Garden of Bones. It needs little tending to grow. Our city, however, would be quite a prize for any empire. Qarth straddles two worlds, a greedy and curious west, and a rich and mysterious east. The marvels of Yeti and Ashai pass through our markets, and share berths with the riches of the free cities and Westeros. Our ports have fulfilled many a trader's dreams, almost as many as they have broken. We call Qarth the greatest city that ever was or will be. An easy claim to make if one knows only the docks and customs houses of other cities. An easy lie to swallow if a people see only the gold and jewels of their rulers, which we, the 13 who govern the city, are careful to ensure. The proud Qartheen shook off the yoke of unjust kings long ago, so they are told at festivals by the pureborn, the king's direct descendants who have controlled the 13 ever since. Only now, instead of scepters, they use ships. A merchant only remains on the 13 until the others are no longer afraid to deny him, or too afraid to deny his replacement. Except for the warlocks, they alone hold a hereditary seat, a relic from when they had powers, or at least from when the world was younger and more easily duped. Over the years, we have developed an understanding with them. They shall always be welcome on our councils and at affairs of state, provided they never come. Rare is the civic problem that can be solved by cryptic nonsense and shade of the evening. Thankfully, they need little encouragement to confine themselves to their House of the Undying. Yet perhaps we Qartheen are too confined ourselves. We feel safe behind our walls and our laws, which no visitor can hope to follow, and by which any citizen who vouches for a guest always pays with his life. But like a ship in the summer seas, a city grows becalmed without fresh wind. The greatest city that ever was or will be? An epitaph. I would prefer the greatest city that is. The East is plagued with mystics who claim many dread powers but prove only one, separating the foolish from their purses. Not so with the renowned warlocks of Qarth. They demand a much dearer coin in return for their parlor tricks. Respect. Once, the warlocks truly were mighty, or so they would have us believe. I do not doubt they have many secrets. They are an old order, and one does not obtain a seat on the 13, the governing council of Qarth, without making 12 of our most powerful citizens afraid to forbid it. Thankfully for Qarth, the warlocks exert little influence in our politics. They rarely leave the confines of the House of the Undying, a pompous name, but, I admit, a strange and dark tower. It is said that none who enter ever leave. Of course, since there are no visible doors, I have to believe none ever enter either. We can only imagine what the warlocks do inside. I wager we do not have to imagine much. They read dusty scrolls detailing their lost glory. They sip shade of the evening, a foul concoction brewed from the nearby trees, until their lips turn blue, the better to frighten children and the ignorant. Stewing in their fantasies like an old soldier who...
Yo, anybody know what I'm listening to? Because it's some shit that I'm not really into, but it sounds pretty cool.
drinks alone so no one may challenge their prowess. Whatever the warlocks may wish, their magic, like all magic, is dead in the world, if it ever existed. Though, one does hear strange whispers of late. Glass candles that have been cold for 100 years, now burning. Ghost grass, found far from the lands of the shadow. A Khalasar led by a woman with 3 heads. Trader's nonsense, most likely. But should the warlock's vaunted magic ever return, that would be a dangerous day for Garth. I shall need to keep my eyes on them. Indeed.
The Free Cities.
At its height, the Valyrian freehold ruled over half the known world. Not bad for former shepherds, but the doom fell on them and sank their capital into the sea. Now Volantis is the ember of old Valyria, ensuring its flame does not go out from this world, as any Volantine will tell you. Pentoshi say the same about Pentos, Lycians about Lys, and so on. But after enough time in the 9 free cities, it's hard to see them as anything but ashes of glory. Volantis is the oldest, the first colony of Valyria. After the Doom, the Volantines tried to rebuild the empire under their rule. They failed, not least because the last Valyrian with dragons, Aegon Targaryen, entered the war against them. Now they are content to dominate only their lower classes, or so they say. Braavos is the strangest, a city erected not by the freehold, but against it. A labyrinth of illusion and deceit to hide the refugees from Valyria's slave lords. After the Doom, the city emerged from the shadows to become one of the greatest banking centers in the world. A man can get anything in Braavos, for a price. Especially death. Your own if you offend one of the swaggering swordsmen that pollute the city. Or, if you're very rich, or very desperate, anyone else's. Lys is the easiest of the free cities, full of pleasure houses catering to every taste, no matter how peculiar. Many men lose themselves in Lys and are never found, at least alive. When a man runs out of coin, the Lycians may grant him their other speciality on the house: poison. Pentos is the most ruthless. The Magisters make a great show of choosing the Prince of Pentos from the great families and granting him the powers of trade, justice, and war, as long as he checks with them first. On the new year, to bring good fortune to Pentos, this prince must deflower the Maid of the Field and the Maid of the Seas. I confess I don't know how each is chosen, or what becomes of them after serving their purpose. But if a crop should fail or a war be lost, the Magisters will slit the prince's throat and choose another. The other free cities are known for what they make. Mia has its lenses and finery, Norvos its axes, Quohor its smiths who can reforge Valyrian steel, Tyrosh its colors. I'm sure Lorath had something to the world, but I can't think of it. Frankly, the 9 of them are more alike than they would care to admit. They hire the same soldiers to fight the same wars for the same rulers, the rich, be they called Magisters, Archons, or what have you. When a Dothraki Khalasar approaches, they gift the same tribute to avoid the same sacking. For thousands of years, the disgraced of Westeros have drained east to pool in the free cities, where a man of honor counts for less than nothing, unless it raises his price. Better men than I have learned that what a man sells for gold, he can never buy back. He must earn it by fire and blood.
My brother Robert Baratheon had raised the banners of Storm's End, our ancestral castle, against the mad King Aerys. Jon Arryn of the Vale and Eddard Stark of the North stood with him, and Hoster Tully of the Riverlands would join. But their lands were far from ours, and separated by the combined strength of the West, the Reach, and King's Landing itself. Even Robert's own lords were against him. It was the hardest choice I've ever made. My brother or my king. Blood or honor. Aerys ruled by right of all the laws in Westeros. Everyone knew the price of defiance, but there are deeper, older laws. The younger brother bows before the elder. I followed Robert. Early in the war, Mace Tyrell's indecisive victory at Ashford cut Robert off from Storm's End. Instead of pursuing Robert and risking his record, Mace Tyrell turned east and laid siege to our home. His vast army and navy encircled us and prevented any resupply by land or sea. If a wagon tried to reach us, it was burnt. If a ship tried to land, it was sunk. We were locked in Storm's End to starve, but Robert commanded me to hold the castle no matter the cost. He could ill afford to lose his ancient seat, which had never fallen. While Robert smashed Rhaegar on the Trident, my men ate the dogs, because the horses had already been devoured. While the Lannisters sacked King's Landing, we ate the rats. If the smuggler Davos had not slipped through the Tyrell blockade with his onions, we'd have eaten our own dead. But I held the castle until Lord Eddard remembered us and marched to lift the siege. The Tyrells didn't even put up a fight. And Robert threw a feast to celebrate Lord Eddard's victory. I was sent to the Royal Island stronghold of Dragonstone to deal with Viserys and Daenerys, the last surviving Targaryen children. Before I arrived, however, they escaped across the narrow sea. Robert was furious. He stripped me of Storm's End and gave it to that prancing fool Renly, my younger brother. I could keep Dragonstone. Now Robert is dead, and a bastard pretender soils my throne while the realm fills with schemers and traitors. But the rightful king is coming for them all, and I will not stop until I have scoured this land clean of abomination. The Baratheons say, ours is the fury. I will show them.
Now this is actually Game of Thrones history and lore. This says session 2, but or season 2, but I already listened to the first one, and it's like an hour or something. But the first one talks about 2 other houses and whatever family controlled the dragons, and they had 3 dragons left, and it was a brother and 2 sisters, but he was fucking his sisters or some shit, and they burnt out all the other fucking kings and created one of the first empires, and that shit went on for generations into the Mad King. Somehow the Mad King fucking murdered a son and his father, and there was a rebellion, and he was assassinated, and they took the throne back from that dude. And now this is like a whole different part of the Game of Thrones world where you're talking about 2 other families or some shit. I said it seems pretty interesting, but I mean the show is popular as hell. I've never seen it because I don't have HBO. Yeah, so it's season 1, 2, and 3. And we're halfway through with this second one. I'm about to get out of here in a minute, though. I'm flipping hungry as hell now.
Family, duty, honor. Every Tully child learns our words, but I was a woman before I understood them. Years before, my father had taken to foster the son of a wartime friend, a minor lord on the Fingers. The boy had arrived at our castle as Peter Baelish. Due to his home and size, my brother soon named him Littlefinger. When I came of age, Brandon Stark of Winterfell sought and won my hand. To my father, Brandon was heir to the north and a suitable match for a daughter of House Tully. To me, Brandon was wild and terrifying, never far from laughter or trouble. I loved him with all the fire of a first passion, much I came to realize as Peter loved me. When Peter heard of my engagement, he challenged Brandon to a duel. Peter survived only because I begged Brandon not to kill him. I still thought of Peter as family. Now, I wish I had let him die. Only days before my wedding, when I thought to be happy forever, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen abducted Brandon's sister, Lyanna. Hot-blooded as always, Brandon immediately rode for King's Landing to demand justice, which the Mad King Aerys Targaryen gave him, in his own twisted fashion. The day the Raven arrived with the news of my Brandon's death, I locked myself in a room and refused to eat for days, until my father reminded me of my duty. I was to marry Eddard, Brandon's younger brother, a man whom I had never met, though of whom none spoke ill, or spoke anything at all. Our union would cement an alliance of the North, Vale, Stormlands, and Riverlands in rebellion against the Mad King. I was a Tully. I did my duty. We were married quickly, and were spared only one night before he had to return to the field. I spent the war by the windows waiting for a raven to hear if my son would grow up fatherless or at all. We knew the price of defeat. I scoured the kitchens and washing rooms for any and all gossip. Robert had won and crushed the Mad King. Robert had lost, but Jaime Lannister was now king. Robert had almost won, but the Mad King had become a dragon and burned King's Landing to ash. At night, I told myself the war would end soon and bring peace. Either a victory or the grave. I was wrong. Robert won, and my husband avenged his brother and my love. But when he came home to me, he could not meet my eyes. I saw the reason by his side. Many men have bastards, I know. And under the strain of war, any man, no matter how honorable, may forsake his vows for a night of warmth that he may never know again. But Ned Stark was not built like other men. His northern honor would not let him sequester his shame in some distant holdfast. He brought this boy, this Jon Snow, home to raise with his true-born children. My children. Yet even these bitter memories are sweet now. They are all I have left of my Ned. Our family is broken and scattered, and our son must wage a war for the pieces. We need to go home. The Starks are of the north, and, like the snows of winter when they come south, they melt away.
In King's Landing, if you leave the Red Keep and aren't careful, you may find yourself in Flea Bottom. In such a cesspool did House Seaworth have its glorious start. I got out as soon as I could, finding work on a smuggler's ship. Soon, every port on the narrow sea had a bounty on me, which they would collect if I didn't pay a percentage to the right people or pick the right tides. You know how to tell a good smuggler? When you talk to one, there's a head that talks back. I was very good. Davos of Flea Bottom had run with orphans and beggars, but Davos the smuggler was received by merchants and lords when nobody would catch them. Oddly, the only honest work came from pirates, like the notorious, bloodthirsty Salvador Sam. An old friend. All he ever wanted was someone to buy his cargo quickly before the tide left, and sell it without telling where I got it. In time, I saved enough to buy a small plot of land and found a woman who was kind enough to overlook my trade. She gave me a son, Mathos. And we dreamt of the traders' circle around the Jade Sea, just one trip, and I could settle us and our family for life. Then some Storm Lord revolted against the Iron Throne. Wars are not as good for smugglers as you'd think. Every harbour fills with guards and inspectors, and the seas fill with blockades and pirates paid by each side to prey on the other. Though I had no love for the Mad King, I'd grown up around the power of King's Landing. I figured this Robert Baratheon would end the same as the other rebel lords, burnt to ash. But he didn't. The North, the Riverlands and the Vale joined him. And in the taverns, people drank to Robert's health openly. Brave fools, I thought, but I had a family who'd be left in the cold if I lost my head. When Mace Tyrell marched on Robert's home of Storm's End, I spied the end of the rebellion. The castle was garrisoned by Robert's younger brother Stannis and a small guard, and would not hold out for long. When it fell, Robert would be homeless, and his support would bleed away. This I knew from experience. Months later, Stannis was still holding the castle. Nobody cared. But on voyages, I had seen what famine does, and I thought of all those men in Storm's End who would die unmourned and forgotten. No better than Flea Bottom orphans. I told my wife and myself that I'd get a high price for the onions and salt beef. In truth, I knew I'd be captured by the Tyrell galleys or drowned, but I was too stubborn. Later that night, in the dark, in a tiny boat with a black sail, I cursed myself and the moonlight as I waited for the tide to turn. When it did, the wind beat the sail so hard I ripped it down, fearing the Tyrell ships would hear. Luckily, they'd grown lax. With muffled oars alone, I steered my cargo through the treacherous currents and snarls of rock that give Shipbreaker Bay its name. The waves finally carried me, soaked and near blind from sea water, through the mouth of the cavern beneath the castle. Then, Stannis Baratheon arrived. The siege had left him gaunt, but not weak, never weak. He greeted me and accepted my onions with cool courtesy, betraying no emotion, even as all wept. He doled out the food to his wife and each of his men before he ate himself, a portion no larger than any other. When he finally thanked me, I could see his mind had already returned to the castle's defense. His duty. After Aerys fell and Lord Stark lifted the siege, Stannis summoned me. For my salvation at Storm's End, I was to be granted a knighthood, a keep of my own, and my son taken into Stannis' personal service. Davos of Flea Bottom had become Sir Davos of House Seaworth, and his son would serve the king's own brother. But for my previous crimes as a smuggler, I was to have the fingertips of one hand taken off above the highest joint. Stannis held that I had flouted the laws of the land for years, and a good act does not wash out the bad. In one fell swoop, or 5, Stannis gave my son a future and my family a name that I could never have imagined, nor earned on my own. I still keep the finger bones in a bag around my neck, to remind me what I was and what I owed to Stannis. For during my many years as a smuggler, I visited many ports, taverns and back alleys, and saw many things in this world, but never justice, until Stannis.
Some great houses call us upstarts, But the truth is that while the Starks and Lannisters fell to the Targaryens in defeat, House Tyrell rose. For thousands of years, our family served as loyal stewards to the kings of the Reach, until the last of their line unwisely burned to death, resisting the Targaryen invaders. To save the Reach from a similar fate, we yielded the castle of Highgarden to Aegon and his sisters. In gratitude, the Targaryens gave House Tyrell dominion over the Reach, and we became lords of the castle in which, for generations, we had served. Under the Targaryen dynasty, Westeros prospered. Gone were the petty wars of 7 kingdoms and the endless thirst for minor
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I do know it all. And I am not arrogant. I'm confident. It's a difference. So shut the fuck up. And I don't cut my wrist, I bite my nails. There's a difference.
Don't you have a train to catch?
Someone on this train does not belong.
All you have to do is find them.
We might die for this shit, nigga. Oh. Might go down for this shit, nigga. Gang, back to that good shit. Niggas say clubs in the first grade. In the shape of the cops ain't serious. Trying to cross the cage, in the school till that game swing. Now I'm back from bed, and my wrist got a band. Got another one name, no name, no vision, no call, get accepted, now force for a man. Where the rats where you from? The nigga on the spot, fuck the seals, let me watch. Got the niggas for the hustle. Spread for the muscle, for the heart, for the knuckles. Put the niggas on bump status. Should have been with the podcast, I ain't gonna mess up with this rush.
You're the anachronism, like a ghost from another time. I am nothing more than a reminder to you that you cannot destroy truth with your authority.
Let's keep it real, son. Count this money, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Hey, yo, put the grants over there in the safe, you know what I'm saying? Cause we spending these Johnsons. The Washingtons go to wifey, you know how that go.
I'm saying that's what this is all about, man. Clothes, bankrolls, and all. You know what I'm saying? Yo, them what, man? What?
Grab something to drink real quick.
Money orientated, I'm destined to live the dream for all my people never made it. Cause shit, we were beginners in the hood, 5%, but something must have got in us. Cause all of us turned to sinners. Got some rest in the pieces, some are sitting in sin wicked. I was such as myself for trying to carry out tradition. Keeping this weapon message, we ghetto western inside us. Cause it provides us with the proper insight to guide us. Even though we know somehow we all gotta go, but as long as we believe it, we'll believe it with some kind of talk. So until that day we expire and turn to papers, me and my capers, a piece of weird stack of plenty papers, keeping it real back and still getting high. Cause life's a bitch and then you die. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's why we get high, cause you never know when you're gonna go. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's why we puff fly, cause you never know when you're gonna go. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's why we get high, cause you never know when you're gonna go. Life's a bitch and then you die. That's why we puff fly.
I woke up early on my born day. I'm 20, it's a blessing. The essence of adolescence leaves my body now pressure. My physical frame is celebrated cause I made it. Recorded through life, surrounded like fame created. Got rhymes 365 days, annual plus some. Pull up the mic and bust one. Cuss while I punch one. My skull cause it's pain in my brain vein. Money maintained, don't go against the grain, simple and plain. When I was younger, this I used to do my thing hard. Rock with foreigners, take their wallets, their jewels, and rip their green cards. Then turn the project flashing my quick cash and got my first piece of ass smoking blunts with hash. Now it's all about cash and abundance. Niggas I used to run with is rich and doing years in the hundreds. I switch your motto instead of saying
having the best snacks, yo. Y'all like these shits? Kiwis? Damn, I love kiwis. That shit was juicy as hell, too. Oh yeah. You ever heard of this right here? That shit called Blunt Power. Remember this Blunt Power shit? That shit's covered any kind of odor. one's going to be blue. And this one's going to be yellow. I'm going to do it the same way, just dark blue letters in a light blue background. And then like dark yellow letters, like a golden yellow and a pale yellow background. Just like the dark green letters in the green background.
Get ready for our list of the 7 most mysterious messages ever hidden in plain sight. The quilts that freed a people. If you were a slave living in 19th century America, you had 2 options. Kick some ass Django style, which probably wouldn't have ended very well as it did in the movie, or take the Underground Railroad to freedom in a free state or Canada. However, the Underground Railroad, a series of secret routes and safe houses used by escaping slaves, wasn't something you could find easily, because that was the point, unless you had the help of a secret coded quilt. Evidence shows some slaves memorized a list of 10 coded images and waited for them to appear on a quilt hung outside by a plantation seamstress. If a monkey wrench pattern was seen, then the slaves knew to pack tools. A bear paw referred to a mountainous escape route. The North Star meant to follow the North Star to freedom, and the carpenter block indicated slaves should look to Jesus to guide them, which probably meant they were royally boned. Quilts were commonly aired outside in those days, so these codes were often in full view of the white slave owners, but they never had a clue what they were looking at. The criminal codes. If you're an urban dweller, you've probably been exposed to a ton of symbols painted on sidewalks that you don't understand. Random lines, circles, numbers, dots. Some are actually engineering symbols. Not all of them, though. And if you see any of these symbols near your home, you might want to get a guard dog. Unbeknownst to most of us, for decades, burglars have shared a secret code to indicate which houses are worth targeting. This symbol means your home has a dog, and the burglar should bring treats. Is this painted outside your home? Sorry, Bob, you're a prime target. And if you see this circle with an arrow pointing inwards, that means you've got nothing worth stealing, or your sidewalk's growing a hairy mole. We know there are way more than 20 symbols we've exposed here, so when this video's finished, maybe you should be going outside to look at some sidewalk graffiti. The codes of OkCupid? If you're the type to look for love online, you're already familiar with code words and phrases to watch out for. Someone who likes pets, usually the crazy cat lady. The term good personality, that's tagged to the 30-year-old guy who plays Dungeons & Dragons with the crazy cat lady. But did you know there are actual codes used on dating profiles which indicate someone's hidden attributes? If someone mentions The Secretary as their favorite movie, that means they like over-the-knee spanking, as does the acronym OTK. But do you know what ABDL stands for? I hope not. That means your future paramour is an adult baby diaper lover.
Right.
Nice. And outside of kink, there are a couple of numbers you'll want to look for too. The number 88 symbolizes a neo-Nazi, which I always find funny because that's a number generally double their IQ. And 437737 indicates the person has herpes but is too embarrassed to say it. Public emergency codes. If a supermarket announcement requests Mr. Extinguisher to meet Mr. Flames in the lobby, either a fire or a huge coincidence has broken out. To avoid causing a panic, many public announcers use codes to inform staff that something bad is happening. At a hospital, Dr. Brown refers to a violent person, and someone being sent to a Rose cottage means a patient has died. Hear someone say code 10 while standing at the counter? That can mean a mass casualty event, or your credit card is suspected for fraud. Either way, get your ass out of there. On a boat, code Oscar means someone is overboard. Code Delta indicates a biohazard, and code Alpha means a medical emergency. And if you're in the London Underground subway, they even have numbers referring to specific interesting spillages. Code 1 is blood, 2, urine or poo, 3 means vomit, 4 is water, 5, broken glass, 6, garbage, and 7 is anything which doesn't fit into those categories, like silly string or piping hot gravy. The symbols of the Illuminati. If you're a fan of Illuminati conspiracies, then you can't help seeing their symbols everywhere. From pop videos and movies, through to buildings and banknotes. For those within this mysterious group, these symbols serve to consolidate their power and display to their members under their control. For example, if you've ever seen a 666 hand symbol, or perhaps a teen pop sensation playing with monarch butterflies, these mean they're under mind control, or they have displayed loyalty to the Illuminati cause. Reptiles are also used to symbolize the cold-blooded nature of the Illuminati's plan for world domination, and the owl represents the secrecy of their mission. Then, of course, there's the all-seeing eye, also known as the Eye of Providence, which reportedly symbolizes the enlightenment of the Illuminati. Oh, and if where you live there's a giant monolithic tower or obelisk, that means that lizard people control your town. So good luck with that. Brand logo secrets. Ever notice the arrow between the A and Z of Amazon? That signifies they sell everything from A to Z. Adidas logo? Why, that's a mountain. Because you can overcome anything if you buy their sneakers. Then there's the hidden arrow in FedEx, the analog and binary symbols in Sony Vaio, and presumably somewhere in Oscar Mayer's logo there's a hidden raccoon anus. Also, take a look at the Beats logo. Ever notice that it's not just a letter B, but also a person wearing the headphones? Pretty neat, right? Starbucks. Why, that's a lady getting shafted for an expensive cup of joe. The secret Russian spy messages. In 2010, the FBI uncovered Russian spy messages hidden out in the open for all Americans to see. So where were they? Newspapers? TV? Written in the sky? No. They were just posted on websites. Moscow communicated with its US-based spy network via steganography by posting secret messages hidden in the binary coding of pictures, audio, video, and torrent files posted online. These messages were used to organize meetings, cash drops, and other information exchanges, all in public view. You may remember when this story came to light, mostly because of the involvement of one Anna Chapman. Yeah, that's a face I'd remember. But this isn't the first time an enemy of America has tried this kind of thing, because both before and after 9/11, there were rumors that Al-Qaeda had started hiding messages in online porn videos. This rumor was never confirmed, but just remember, that little laptop habit of yours could be helping the terrorists win. Did this video pique your curiosity a bit? Then let's pique it a bit more. Watch our top 7 financial conspiracies video, then subscribe if you haven't already. From mysterious gelatinous goo that falls from the sky, or flaming balls of fire that rise up out of the water in Thailand, to lightning in the form of a ball that seems to act as if it has an intelligence guiding it. These are the top 10 most mysterious natural phenomena. It is important that you now understand a portal, and an important decision awaits you after you finish being mystified by the discoveries in this video when you arrive at the end. Number 10. The Tunguska explosion.
Oh.
One of the Earth's largest...
Now, I know what he's going to say about that. I actually do know about that. That shit was in, like, Russia somewhere, and these motherfuckers think that, Nikola Tesla was doing some kind of experiment, and it fucked up, and it made, like, this massive energy ball or some shit, but... because there's like this forest that was fucking decimated and everything is flattened and leveled the fuck out like there was some kind of major impact, but there's no fucking crater. It's like nothing actually hit the ground. It was, and to this day, like, motherfuckers still cannot explain that shit. Like, yo, what the fuck really happened here? It was some kind of major event, explosion. I think they said there was a light and everything with it. But then you go there to ground zero and like all the trees are flat and look burnt up, but literally no crater, like nothing actually touched the ground. The Tunguska experiment. Yeah, that's crazy. He brought that shit up on the list like number 7. I was just listening to something about that like the other week, yo. Why? Because I like strange stories like that.
Just alleged meteorite impacts recorded in modern times occurred in a remote area of Siberia in 1908. The explosion was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It registered as a 5.0 earthquake on the Richter scale and sent an electromagnetic pulse halfway around the world. Ground Zero was a 5-mile wide area of scorched tree trunks, with a blast area extending 45 miles beyond where all the trees were knocked flat by the force of the shockwave. It killed hundreds of Siberian natives and political exiles instantly, and hundreds more died within a week, apparently from radiation poisoning. Strangely, many reliable witnesses claimed seeing a burning white cylinder with a multicolored tail dropping from the sky, but no crater or comet debris has ever been found. Meteors don't typically cause EMPs or radiation poisoning, and aren't usually described as burning white cylinders, prompting investigators to wonder exactly what happened. The Tunguska Paradox remains the world's most powerful unexplained explosion event. Number 9. Hessdalen Lights. These unexplained lights have been witnessed and recorded over a remote valley in southern Norway, usually only appearing about a dozen times a year, but sometimes up to 20 times a week, since at least the 1980s. They've been seen to fly across the sky, sometimes separating into many smaller units and merging with a larger flying object. But these lights are no mirage. They've left measurable evidence behind. University researchers have discovered strange formations in the snow resembling crop circles directly below the aerial activity. Tested samples show that the snow within the tracks have been completely sterilized of all microbes compared to snow surrounding the tracks, with no signs of heat energy causing it to melt. Professor J. Allen Hynek, the renowned U.S. Air Force scientific advisor on UFO studies, claimed that Hessdalen has had the best equipment and the best period of operation and observation of the UFO phenomena from any place in the world. Number 8. Ball lightning. In one of nature's most freak occurrences, lightning strikes and a fiery white-hot ball of electricity spins into existence. It hovers and bobs like a ghost with a strange sort of intelligence to its movements as it slowly glides around whilst disappearing through walls until it suddenly winks itself out of existence. Despite the fact that 5% of the world's population claims to have witnessed ball lightning, its unpredictability and incredible rarity have virtually hidden it from science, until recently. In 2014, Chinese scientists published an experiment in which they managed to record a ball lightning on a high-speed spectroscope, which revealed the ball's chemical composition and finally, at least proved, its existence. There's still a long way to go, but it's a start. We may have beat the Chinese to the moon, but they managed to prove the existence of ball lightning. Number 7. St. Elmo's Fire. No, not that St. Elmo's Fire. Unfortunately, it's not a Muppet on fire either. Once thought to be a type of ball lightning, this is a natural weather phenomena in which violet flames of electric sparks form along sharp or pointed objects in a strong electric field like a thunderstorm. Named after the patron saint of sailors, it was most commonly witnessed at sea along the masts of ships and was thought to be the saint protecting the ship in the storm. It's also frequently witnessed streaking across aircraft wings and along the nose cone. Benjamin Franklin's lightning experiments helped to determine that it's actually caused by a high difference in voltage between clouds and the ground below them. When the doomed Hindenburg Zeppelin blew up on its transatlantic trip to New Jersey, it was St. Elmo's Fire that ignited the hydrogen blimp as it attempted to land. Number 6. The Marfa Ghost Lights. At times, they appear colored as they twinkle in the distance, move about, split apart, melt together, disappear, and reappear. Despite the findings of most skeptical investigations, Marfa, Texas residents have been watching these bewildering lights that defy explanation since 1883, several decades before automobiles were invented and commonplace in America. Long before that, the Apache tribes in the area considered them to be fallen stars. Eyewitnesses insist that the apparently intelligent and coordinated interactions between these will-o-wisps indicate that these are much more than simply car headlights reflected in a mirage. Maybe there's something more ghostly or extraterrestrial in origin. Maybe not. But what else could they be? Number 5. Sailing stones. This geological phenomena occurs most dramatically in California's Death Valley, and is even more interesting than watching weekend warriors getting their SUVs stuck in a ditch. Small rocks and massive boulders mysteriously slide across the desert, leaving long, obvious tracks behind them, sometimes hundreds of feet long. The crazy thing is, no one has ever seen them move. The movements also appear to be totally random. Two rocks approximately the same size, weight, and shape placed close together might sail in completely different directions at different speeds, or maybe not move at all. After 100 years of scientific study, the leading theory is that thin layers of frost form overnight and the wind pushes the rocks around the desert. Which kind of makes sense, except that this is the hottest place on Earth. It doesn't usually freeze. And why wouldn't we see similar phenomena in Canada or other places that really do have ice and wind? Number 4, Mekong Lights. Known by the Thailand locals as Naga fireballs, these mysterious balls of flame rise up out of the Mekong River in late October. Number 4, Mekong Lights. Known by the Thailand locals as Naga fireballs, these mysterious balls of flame rise up out of the Mekong River in late October near the end of Vesak.
Is that just funny to me? Naga fireballs. The bug got me bugging out, yo. But I'm definitely gonna have to post this shit on fucking Facebook. Ask them. I'm gonna ask some of my homies if they got some of those kind of. If y'all got some of these kind of fireballs. Damn. All right, I'm done.
Number 4, Mekong Lights.
Mekong Lights.
Known by the Thailand locals as Naga fireballs, these mysterious balls of flame rise up out of the Mekong River in late October near the end of Vesak, a kind of Buddhist Lent. Flaming spheres, some the size of basketballs and others just barely a spark, rise up naturally out of the water and float up hundreds of feet into the sky before disappearing. Sometimes just a few dozen per night, and sometimes thousands. Locals believe them to be the breath of Naga, legendary serpents that live in the Mekong River. According to legend, during the 3 months of Vesak, the Naga are dormant while they meditate. Then when they awake, they breathe the fireballs to celebrate. There is no scientific explanation for the phenomena. Number 3, bioluminescent waves. It's like magic in a tropical paradise. Every evening on the Maldives' Vadhu Island, glowing blue pixie dust shimmering in the waves washes over the romantic moonlit beach. But it's not just some trick of the light, it's real. You can scoop it up with your hands, and it forms pools and footsteps left in the sand. This mysterious natural phenomena is actually caused by very rare bioluminescent photoplankton known as sea sparkle. The glow is a defense mechanism triggered by the agitation of the waves lapping the shore, but we don't know exactly what it's trying to defend itself from. It's thought that the glow might deter small predators and attract larger ones to help scare them away. Although not as mysterious as the other items on this list, the sheer beauty of this phenomena earns it the number 3 spot on our list. Number 2, star jelly. This gelatinous substance is sometimes found on the ground, patios, and hanging from tree branches after a meteor shower. Hundreds of years ago, it was considered a medicinal ingredient known as Stella Terra, used in the treatment of hot abscesses. Some areas of Mexico refer to it as Casa de Luna, which is probably better left untranslated. It's a commonly held belief that star jelly is extraterrestrial organic matter found in molecular clouds in space, the stellar nurseries where stars are born. Long ignored by mainstream science, awareness of star jelly was brought to the forefront recently when large amounts of the gooey stuff appeared in a European nature reserve on the day of a meteor strike. Samples were sent for DNA analysis to finally prove the various fungal or frog egg theories. But strangely, no DNA was detected, and the substance has yet to be identified. Number 1, the Big Bang. The mystery behind all mysteries lies in the birth of our universe, the Big Bang Theory. Modern thinking considers it almost to be a fact, but it is just a theory. Turn on your TV to channel 1 and all that static is supposed to be the residual noise of that 14 billion-year-old explosion. But assuming the theory is correct, what state did the universe exist in beforehand? And what caused it to explode into creation? And could it explode again? Is it possible that the Big Bang was just a tool God used to disperse the cosmos? And if so, why? We may never find out for sure what happened. But in the meanwhile, we might as well enjoy the ride as planet Earth spins us through space with all the craziness of a tilt-a-whirl. Welcome. You are now facing the very important decision I spoke of before. You can relax, though, as...
I will guide you into making the correct choice. Only click on a related video from the sidebar or the grid of videos that pops up after this video if it says it's from the Strange Mysteries channel. The only other correct choice is to click here and become awestruck as you travel back in time and feel as if you're literally witnessing unbelievable events taking place not only in Egypt, but around the world that are so profound that they change the way you view reality, your existence, and where you really came from. As you arrive in an ancient Egypt, very different from the one you were taught in school, or think you already know in our 8 biggest mysteries of the pyramids you haven't heard of video. Ignoring my guidance will cause you to experience disappointment, an unimaginably horrible feeling causing impurity of the mind, body, and soul. This is the cost of making the wrong choice in this important decision. Do not clutter your mind with the thoughts of clicking the large subscribe button in front of you. It is merely an instrument utilizing the struggle of willpower that you are experiencing in this present moment. Do not click the subscribe button for a genesis of realizations which can only be experienced from within. I am aware that you have always felt something was missing in your life, and that you are, as you hear each word I say, now beginning to feel a sense of enlightenment about how clicking the subscribe button always was and always will be your destiny. Therefore, just as the feelings inside of you resonate with each word I speak, your realizations have already proved you with the knowledge that this will inevitably happen in time, regardless, my son.
Yo, the Strange Mystery Team, these guys are fucking weird as shit. But I like them. Don't always agree with them, but I do like them.
Historical fiction often paints the Nazis as a band of evil geniuses with futuristic prototype technology capable of leveling Earth's cities. But in their defense, that's a very unfair and false way to portray them. More accurately, the Nazis were actually a band of insane evil geniuses developing so crazy it's like they had literally traveled in time 75 years into the future, where they discovered games like Call of Duty and Halo, which is where they got most of their ideas from. From sonic wave cannons that turned your organs into marinara, to a literal sun gun, to a final weapon so evil, horrific, devastating, and unnecessarily thorough that many believe it couldn't have even existed. These are the top 10 Nazi secret superweapons. Number 10. The Sonic Cannon. If you were hoping for a weapon which fired sassy, tiny blue hedgehogs, then prepare to be equally disappointed and frightened. In the early 1940s, Nazi engineers developed a sonic cannon that could rip you apart without you ever even knowing what the hell was going on. Tubes containing methane and oxygen were ignited to pulse detonate 2 parabolic dishes at around 44 hertz. Following me so far? Well, let's simplify it. This machine could create sound waves so aggressive they would render your kidneys, liver, and spleen into a human marinara. The rapid compression and release of organ tissue and fluids barely affected the heart, stomach, and intestines, but that's no great comfort when the rest of your inside parts are rapidly dribbling out of your anus. Anyone within 50 meters would be torn to bits internally within a minute, and even those up to 400 meters away would still be crippled with vertigo and nausea. Unfortunately for the Nazis, this weapon was far too fragile to survive even a round from a potato gun. If only they had waited 50 years, they could have achieved the same effect much easier with a boombox and a playlist of Kesha tracks. Number 9. The Feisler FI-103R Reichenberg. Throughout the war, V-1 rockets rained down on Europe, but only 25% of them hit their target. So, how did the ever-efficient Germans increase their accuracy? They just did the most obvious thing: stick a guy inside of the rocket. Luftwaffe pilots were expected to pilot these missiles into their opponents after being released from a bomber. But unsurprisingly, not many were very keen on spending their final moments strapped into a plywood bucket seat riding a giant firework. Those kind-hearted Nazis therefore added an ejector seat. Chances of survival, less than 1%. Number 8, the V3 cannon. Based in Pas-de-Calais in northern France, this giant supergun was to be used to bombard London using multi-charged shells which used secondary propellants to extend their range. Imagine video games where you get a huge mid-air boost to your jump. Take that principle, but with fiery boom boom death at the end of it. Standing at 130 meters tall and capable of firing 300 shells per hour, Allied raids destroyed this behemoth before completion, thank God. However, other prototypes were used to bombard Luxembourg from 58 miles away. That's pretty impressive, except nobody really knows where Luxembourg is, or really cares. Nazi secret weapon number 7, the X-ray gun. The Germans researched several types of energy-directed weapons with the help of the technology company Siemens, who now directs radiation into your brain far more efficiently using mobile phones. So if the Germans had radioactive laser rifles back then, why aren't they prevalent today? Well, these weapons weren't for use on humans, as even their negligible cancerous effects would take years to bear results. Way to play the long game, Nazis. The X-ray gun actually pre-ionized the ignition inside aircraft engines as a way of bringing them down within range of more conventional anti-aircraft weaponry. Number 6. Aggregate rockets. The aggregate rocket family is even more destructive than that family of Hicks who lives 2 doors down and never mows their lawn. Its most famous member was the V2 missile, responsible for 9,000 deaths in 3 cities. And that was just the start. One of the next generation in production was the H-12, a massive upgrade capable of putting 10 tons of payload in low Earth orbit despite weighing in at 3,500 tons fully fueled. What was its range? Modern analysis suggests that if completed, it could have easily pounded the US mainland from a base in Europe, making it potentially the worst European import since Piers Morgan. We're only at number 5, and the Nazis are already trying to build a sun gun. If you played Call of Duty or watched a few Bond films, then this will look familiar. In a scheme worthy only of Mr. Burns, the Nazis planned to create a space station mounted with a 100-meter wide mirror. But this wasn't just a vanity project so Hitler could check out his sweet stash and partying on the go. The plan was to reflect the sun's light into a concentrated beam of scorching heat, capable of tearing through cities and armies. I knew the Nazis were the kind of jerks in high school who burned ants with magnifying glasses, except much worse, obviously. Unfortunately for Hitler, nobody told him that A, light doesn't work like that, and B, this technology was around 50 to 100 years away. Alright, let's get serious. Number 4. The Vortex Cannon. I'm bored of firing regular old shells and bullets, said one Nazi scientist. Let's just go mental and make a gun that fires effing hurricanes. Agreed, Manfred. This ridiculous anti-aircraft cannon generated explosions in a combustion chamber, which were then guided down special nozzles towards their target. So it was more a fiery tornado rifle than a hurricane gun. But that's still admittedly pretty badass. Nazi scientists actually managed to make weapons that you would find in The Legend of Zelda. Anyways, a scale model that the Nazis built managed to destroy wooden structures 600 feet away, but the full-size version couldn't do squat against actual planes flying in the air, thankfully. It would really suck to be an Allied pilot and then having to dodge tornadoes made out of fire being shot at you. Number 3. The Hinckley 162. Designed and built in 3 months in 1944, this was actually a crowdsourced design by the German public on an initiative set up by the Nazis to find a simple defensive aircraft that could be mass-produced. Really, mass-produced. With wooden wings and a cheap metal fuselage, around 100 of them were built, and very few were flown successfully. So why was this crappy airplane so interesting? It was designed to be flown by inexperienced pilots, as most of the German aces had the bad habit of being blown to pieces. Who were these inexperienced pilots? The Hitler Youth, of course. Yep, that's right. The Nazis wanted to use children as their secret weapon to win the war, putting them on par for child exploitation with the Gap Corporation. Number 2. The Rat Tank. Known to Germans as the Land Cruiser, this 1,000-ton beast was just as huge as it was impractical. Essentially, it was the Kim Kardashian of World War II. Sure, its sheer size and use of submarine technology meant it would have crossed rivers with ease, but it couldn't even traverse a basic road or bridge without obliterating it. A vehicle of this size, traveling at only 40 miles per hour, would have been a sitting duck for enemy bombers. So, what did Hitler do? He proposed an even heavier tank, the Monster, weighing in at 1,500 tons. I'm beginning to think that Hitler maybe wasn't that smart, or maybe he just wasn't very good at thinking up weapons. He should probably leave that task to bored Nazi scientists so they can invent more tornado guns. And finally, number 1, the Bell. Near the Wenceslas mine in Germany, by the Czech border, was a secret Nazi facility known as the Giant. Much like David Hasselhoff's mine, we don't know what went on in there, but Polish intelligence claimed to have found something horrifying. At first glance, a metallic bell-shaped object no bigger than 3 by 5 meters wouldn't seem too intimidating. Then they found the blueprints. Inside were 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a substance similar to mercury, codenamed Zerum 525, in addition to various peroxides. The weapon's purported function? Well, within a 150 to 200 meter zone, it would separate your blood into gel, crystallize your flesh, and decompose plant life into grease. Many skeptics claim this technology, whilst feasible, never actually existed. Frankly, I don't really care. Someone has thought of it, and now I want humanity to unthink it, please. I mean, is it really necessary to have a weapon that turns everyone who is around's blood into gel, in addition to crystallizing their flesh, and then it has to kill the plants too? This just seems a little overboard to me. I wonder who first thought up the idea for this. I'd be willing to bet another one of those bored Nazi scientists had something to do with this. Want to discover more crazy just like this? Well then check out our top 10
We'll come back in here later on and work on the shoes and the chair. And maybe maybe get to the bone.
Humans have not less than 1% of the observable universe. In that 1%, black holes that maraud across the galaxy, planets where it rains glass sideways.
But that is looking pretty dope right now.
What is it coming for our children? I'm Nathan from Strange Mysteries, and find out the answers to these and much more in this episode of The Strange.
I'm gonna grab some lunch and run a couple errands. Gotta go get some deodorant, laundry detergent, some other shit. I'm happy I wrote it down because I would never remember that shit. But anyway, oh yeah, and I gotta do some laundry. Peace. Till next time. Oh shit.